Well, good morning, everyone. I see there's people still logging into the workshop, so we're going to start. Actually, we'll start right now. So again, good morning and welcome to our virtual workshop meeting sponsored by the California Air Resources Board. Today's meeting is part of the Advanced Clean Fleets regulatory efforts of achieving a zero-emission truck and bus California fleet by 2045 everywhere feasible, and significantly earlier for certain market segments such as last mile delivery, public fleets, and drayage applications. The goal of this effort is to accelerate the number of medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle purchases to help achieve a full transition to zero emission vehicles in California as soon as possible. My name is Craig During, and I am managing the efforts for the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation. I want to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded. So by entering the Zoom meeting, you are agreeing to being recorded. A copy of this recording will be made available on our website. Today's meeting is the second of a series of 3 workshops that will provide an overview of the updated draft regulation language released on April 25th. The focus of today's meeting will be on the state and local government fleet requirements of this regulation. Our third workshop is scheduled for Friday, May 6th, and will focus on drayage truck requirements. More details regarding this upcoming meeting are available on our website. Also available on our website are the materials for today's meeting. This includes access to the workshop agenda, presentation, and the draft regulation language that we will be discussing today. Our website also provides links to our informal comment log and comment submittal form. More information on how to submit comments will be discussed during the presentation. Today's meeting is scheduled to end by noon, and the meeting agenda provides details and estimated times for when specific topics will be discussed. Once again, our focus today is on state and local government fleet requirements of this regulation. Our intention is to allow for full and open communication throughout the meeting and allow our stakeholders to ask questions, seek clarification, and provide comments specific to this part of the regulation. Therefore, I encourage everyone to hold any comments or questions related to other topics such as drayage trucks for the next workshop scheduled for this Friday. And let me remind everyone again that this meeting is being recorded, and a recording of the meeting will be made available on our website for those unable to attend or are interested in viewing it again. During the meeting, the chat and ask question features will not be available. Therefore, you will only be able to ask a question or make a comment verbally by raising your hand and using your microphone. We will call upon individuals in the order your hand was raised, and when called upon, we ask you to unmute your mic, state your comment and question. And as a reminder, please introduce yourself by first stating your name and affiliation before making your comments. Due to the expected large number of participants, I would very much appreciate if speakers could limit your comments to no more than 2 to 3 minutes so others do have the opportunity to speak. Finally, I would like to recognize my colleagues and panelists who will be presenting and answering questions during our workshop. They include Tony Brazil, Paul Arnasia, Olivia Lane, Harinder Fagura, Molly Buns, and others who will introduce themselves when called upon. If you do experience technical difficulties during the meeting, please email Harinder Fagura for assistance. His email address can be found on the meeting notification bulletin you received to register for this event. Okay, with that said, let me introduce our first presenter today, Harinder Fagura, who will walk us through the first part of today's presentation. Harinder, take it away.
Thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone. My name is Harinder Figura, and I am in the Mobile Source Control Division. For today's workshop, we'll be going over a brief introduction and background of the state's emission reduction goals, the zero emission vehicle market outlook, and a detailed regulatory overview of the state and local government fleets requirements. We will be providing more details about drayage truck requirements later this week. We will conclude today's workshop with an overview of emissions benefits and the next steps. Meeting materials. Meeting materials for this workshop can be accessed through our meetings and events webpage of the Advanced Clean Fleets website. In addition, staff will continue to accept informal comments through the informal comment docket, where the comments are posted online through meetings and other means to work through issues. Early feedback on the proposal is welcome and encouraged. As seen on this slide, California has the worst air quality in the nation. Major reductions of oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, and fine particulate matter emissions, or PM 2.5, are needed to achieve federal air quality attainment. As many of you know, the truck and bus regulation requires most diesel trucks to have a 2010 or newer engine by 2023, but more needs to be done. In addition, legislature and governor are addressing our climate challenge by setting aggressive greenhouse gas reductions targets to achieve carbon neutrality and zero carbon grid by 2045. As seen on this chart, transportation contributes to 40% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in California. This increases to about 50% when including upstream emissions. In September 2020, the governor signed an executive order N-79-20 that established targets for the transportation sector to help put the state on the path to carbon neutrality by 2045. In addition, the California Air Resources Board has developed a suite of planning documents to provide a roadmap to how to meet all our emissions reduction goals. The Advanced Clean Fleets regulation is one part of these efforts. This slide narrows to truck transportation. There are approximately 1.8 million trucks operating in California in many different configurations and sizes. Although Class 7 and 8 tractors only account for 12% of the total population, they represent about 48% of the daily NOx emissions statewide. Next, we'll be providing some background on the zero emission vehicle market. One of the primary zero emission market drivers is the Advanced Clean Truck regulations to ensure a wide range of trucks are available and the ZEV market is supported. As seen in the table, the regulation requires truck manufacturers to sell zero emission vehicles as an increasing percentage of their total annual sales beginning with the 2024 model year. This regulation also included a one-time fleet reporting requirement, which I will discuss next. In April 2021, CARB collected truck and fleet operational data required by the one-time reporting requirement. The data collected is summarized here and available in an aggregated form on our website and is helping us with the rulemaking effort. California is not alone when it comes to deploying zero emission vehicles. There are currently 12 other states that have adopted California's light duty advanced clean cars regulation, and 6 other states have adopted our medium and heavy duty advanced clean trucks regulation. In addition, 17 states, including the District of Columbia and the province of Quebec, Canada, have signed a memorandum of understanding committing to electrification across the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector. As you can see on the map, West Coast states have adopted the ACT regulation and have committed to zero emission vehicle deployments. This improves the potential for accelerating ZEV truck corridors. This slide shows that there are more than 140 commercially available zero emission vehicles across every vehicle weight class category and in a wide variety of configurations, and manufacturers continue to make announcements for new product offerings. I'd also like to point out that there are already more than 500 ZEV models available worldwide. Taking a closer look at zero emission tractors, you can see that there are 8 commercially available models today, with more coming in the near future. The majority of trucks in class 4 and above are manufactured using a cab and chassis, and then they are upfitted with a body configuration to meet its primary intended functions. The same thing applies to zero emission trucks. As seen on the slides, the same zero emission model cab and chassis is used for multiple truck configurations. This slide shows fleet data that was collected from our one-time reporting requirement, where fleet owners were asked what their daily mileage was for different truck types. As you can see, most trucks operate less than 100 miles a day. This is largely consistent with prior data collected from the Vehicle Inventory and Use Survey in 2018, and shows that mileage needs can already be met by zero emission trucks that are available today. We recognize that for some work trucks, daily operation mileage does not paint the full picture and have factored into our thinking. I will now turn over the presentation to our next presenter, Poncelay, who will discuss the state and local government fleet requirements of the regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rainer, and good morning. Today, I'll start by covering the proposal scope and applicability, vehicle exemptions, and general requirements. Then we'll cover the proposed provisions, including exemption or extension options, and finish with an example of fleet compliance scenario. Okay, 1 second. To begin with the scope and applicability, the proposed state and local fleet requirements apply to any state or local government agency with at least one vehicle over 8,500 pounds gross vehicular weight rating. This excludes federal agencies, which are already addressed in the high priority and federal fleets section of the regulation. Next, vehicles exempt from the proposal include emergency vehicles such as emergency vehicles, school buses, and military tactical vehicles. In addition, vehicles subject to other regulations such as transit bus innovative clean transit regulation are also exempt. Of particular note for many public agencies, there's a new exemption for 2-engine vehicles. State and local fleets. This slide outlines the current requirements for state and local government fleets. When adding vehicles to their fleet, these agencies will need to ensure that starting in 2024, 50% of the vehicles added to the fleet are zero emission. Beginning in 2027, 100% of the vehicles added to the fleet would need to be zero emission. The primary difference today is that this is now an additional requirement. So used vehicles added to the fleet will also need to be zero emission, or previously it was a purchase requirement, applying only to new vehicles. There's a 3-year exemption for designated counties, highlighted red in the map on the side. For these counties, the requirements would not begin until 2027. Lastly, until 2035, the fleet may purchase or add near zero emission vehicles if there's no zero emission vehicle available. The definition near zero emission vehicle is the same as in the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, where it's a plug-in hybrid vehicle that meets a minimum all-electric range requirement. Next, I'll walk through some of the updated or newly added provisions. We've proposed adding a provision where any ZEV addition to the fleet, earlier or in excess of what is required by the proposal, can count towards future requirements. The zero-emission vehicle would have to remain in the fleet while claiming the credit, and each zero-emission vehicle can only be counted once towards future requirements. Public fleets are proposed to be allowed to purchase and designate a combustion-powered vehicle as a backup vehicle. Backup vehicles are those that operate less than 1,000 miles per year, excluding any additional miles driven during emergency operations. Fleets would need to report the backup vehicle and submit annual odometer readings to use this exemption. The fleet will also be able to, by using this exemption, fleets will be able to purchase an internal combustion engine vehicle and designate it as a backup as long as it's stay below the annual mileage threshold. Next, staff is proposing to add a provision for purchasing combustion powered vehicles if there's no zero emission vehicle available in that configuration. CARB would host a list on our website listing vehicles that are not considered commercially available. This does not apply to commonly vehicles that are expected to be commonly electrified, such as pickups, buses, box trucks, vans, or any other tractors. This list can be expanded, or vehicles can be removed by any stakeholders submitting documentation. And vehicles on this list will be grouped by their gross vehicular weight rating, or their vehicle weight classes, and also by their primary intended function or configuration. Once a vehicle is removed from the list, there's a 6-month grace period. So if a fleet intends to apply for this exemption, the fleet owner may purchase any combustion powered vehicle, and they can designate that the vehicle is on the list, and they would report when it's delivered. To show that a zero emission vehicle or near zero emission vehicle is not available, the documentation must be submitted showing that the vehicle actually exists as a combustion powered vehicle, that no complete zero emission vehicles are sold in equivalent configurations, that no zero emission chassis available to be equipped in the configuration, and no zero emission conversion can be installed on a vehicle in that configuration. So the fleet will need to report this exemption during the reporting and submit a picture of the vehicle purchased. Next, staff are proposing to add an extension to cover situations where the fleet has already begun instruction on needed zero emission infrastructure, but the construction is delayed for reasons beyond the fleet owner's control. The fleet would need to submit documentation showing that the construction began at least 1 year prior to the compliance deadline. And there's a list of eligible reasons listed here and in the draft regulatory language. If this exemption is granted, the fleet would be able to delay taking delivery of the zero emission vehicles that were already ordered. Fleets which have mutual aid agreements in place to send vehicles during declared emergencies can submit a request to request that portion of their fleet can remain as combustion powered vehicles. In order to be eligible, the fleet will already need to be 75% zero emission, and the fleet will need to demonstrate that mobile fueling would not be an option in that situation. This does not apply to common smaller vehicles common vehicles such as pickups, buses, box trucks, and others listed on the slide. It is mainly intended for larger vehicles that are class 4 through 8. Reporting will be required by April 1st every year, including information about the agency and vehicles owned and operated by the agency. Vehicle and exemptions or extension documentation must be kept and provided on request. Finally, this example shows a 100 truck public fleet where zero emission vehicles are added to the fleet starting in 2024. Given the assumed replacement cycle of 15 years, the fleet would reach 100% zero emission in roughly 2042. This includes the regulatory portion of the presentation. So I think at this point we'll stop for questions and answers, and we'll come back and finish the rest of the presentation later in the meeting. So we are requesting that to ensure that we can get through all the comments, the commenters keep their questions within about 3 minutes. And I think that's it. Anything else to add, Craig or Tony, or should we just begin?
No, I think we're ready.
Okay.
There are 6 people in line to speak. Nick, Blair, I'm unmuting your mic. You may speak.
Very good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Nick Blair. I'm a regulatory advocate for ACWA, Association of California Water Agencies, representing over 460 public water agencies across California. We appreciate the effort CARB has taken to incorporate our past comments and concerns into consideration with the public fleet provisions, and also appreciate the time that board members have taken to meet with us. However, we're still going to continue to be vigilant in this rulemaking, as we think there are still some clarifications needed, and also additional considerations. So first, with thinking about clarity, we need additional clarity on declared emergencies. We want to dive into the order of operations as it relates to backup vehicles, internal combustion vehicles, and local boards versus the CARB executive officer. We also want to dive a little more into the early action provision, but we do appreciate that that was added. It is something we asked for. We would like, with the public funds provision, to have a list of what counts as being able to be used towards new vehicles versus not. So, and then additionally, we want further clarity on the process for developing and claiming exemptions. It sounds like we have an early sketch at this point, but we'll be eager to see how it plays out. And also with mutual aid, there's a lot of if-then statements. So we would also like to further understand how to navigate that provision of the exemption process. And we remain concerned about these unavailability considerations that are not specified in the draft, such as cost and affordability, access to needed vehicles that are oversubscribed if everybody is trying to get them, unique specifications that are not written out, such as far terrain and distance, PTO cycles, weight of vehicles, and lastly, the possibly being out of compliance with air quality management district rules by complying with the CARB rule. And in addition, we're also still concerned about the timing of 2024 as a start date, given that this rule will not be finalized likely until early 2023. And lastly, with regard to reporting and administrative requirements, we want a little more clarity on what documentation is needed and timely responses from CARB to know if the exemption is approved or not. And we also will plan to submit written comments following this meeting to further clarify what we're asking for. Once again, thank you very much. And I apologize if there's feedback. I'm hearing it on my end.
No, you sounded fine, thanks.
That's
Next
great.
in line.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, go ahead.
Next in line to speak is Sarah Desloriers. Sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Sarah, before you start, I just want to make a comment. So Nick, you raised a number of items, and so I'll just start with saying, part of the point of the meeting here is to have an open discussion, identify what the issues are. So appreciate your comments. But we also have that comment log that you can submit your comments in writing to. So if you have some particular suggestions or even pointing out areas that aren't as clear, by all means do that, and everyone here, please do that. And then I'm hoping that some of your questions will be answered as part of this meeting. And so feel free to come back later if some of the items are still, if you have different comments on these same points. And I just want to make sure everybody understands that. Yeah, we appreciate you keeping your comments relatively short, but you have multiple times to come back. And so it's not like you only have one shot to make your comments. So we're going to try to keep it more of a dialogue as best we can. Thank you.
Sarah, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes. So my name is Sarah Delorier, and I am the Climate Change Program Manager for the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, the members of which represent over 90% of the sewer population across the state. We perform essential public services of cleaning wastewater to protect public health and the environment, while also advancing community resilience through the recovery of renewable sources, including biogas, which we'll talk about today. Our members do fully support and are focused on helping the state achieve carbon neutrality. The use of renewable biogas in particular, derived from wastewater treatment as a transportation fuel, is a critical path to achieving the Senate Bill 1383 mandates, as well as carbon neutrality, while also maintaining our essential public services for all communities at all times, no matter what kind of disaster we face. Anaerobic digestion is a key component of the solids treatment process at wastewater treatment plants, and that produces that renewable biogas or digester gas that we're talking about. By capturing that renewable resource, we do avoid wasting it. Instead, we do want to beneficially use it. Most of that is used on site for power production, of course, resilience in mind, as a transportation fuel or pipeline injection. But no single use of this can utilize all of the biogas that is currently produced or will be produced across the state once Senate Bill 1383 is implemented. What we're concerned about here is that there's a real clear disconnect between the scoping plan scenarios to achieve carbon neutrality, which does include RNG as a CNG as part of transportation, where with the draft ACF regulatory language that does not allow for that at this time, the way it's written. And then the Clean Air Act timelines to achieve NOx and ozone reductions in non-attainment zones. This is highly concerning just given the unlimited availability of heavy duty ZEVs technology for those specialty vehicles, including vacuum and jetter vehicles, and the fact that NZEVs are available today to provide that continued resilience that we need as an essential public service while also achieving the NOx reductions. And our members have already been required to invest in those vehicles fueled by renewable biomethane, as well as infrastructure. By regulatory requirements that are already in place, so you'd mentioned existing regulations, for example, the South Coast Rule 1196. So while CNG is shown in all of the scoping plan scenarios for heavy duty vehicles, the definition of NZEV at this time in the draft ACF does not allow for it. So we see that there really does need to be coordination across regulatory efforts and acknowledgement of how critical it is to maintain these essential public services we provide. So we do request that CARB staff carefully coordinate across scoping plan programs that ensures compliance with existing regulations like the Federal Clean Air Act, as you mentioned, and Senate Bill 1383, while also achieving carbon neutrality and not losing sight of the kind of critical need we have for essential public services to remain resilient at all times. So thanks for your presentation. Members will be speaking about different specific items related to the language, their questions. As Nick had mentioned, a number of different topics. We have same topics that we'll be providing detailed comments on. But yeah, questions will be coming up more on the language, but we did want to note that disconnect. But thank you for this time today.
Okay.
Next in line, Tony, did you want to speak to
Yeah,
that?
well, yeah, I kind of want to start getting into some of the issues. I anticipate they'll come up, but I'll just pick out a couple, and then I anticipate we'll cover many, but if we don't, by all means, bring them back up. So one of the comments was about specifically about NZEVs or near zero emission vehicles that traditionally the definitions included natural gas engines because we do have an optional standard at which they can be certified. And the comment was that would be a strategy to continue to get NOx reductions. But I want to make sure everybody does understand that the board adopted the low NOx omnibus regulation that in essence says that any engine certified for sale in California starting in 2024 must meet that new standard and a number of changes to warranty and durability testing requirements that would ensure that real world emissions are effectively 90% lower than where they are in the engine certified today. So what you're referring to as, in other words, an engine that's certified to the low NOx optional standard today will probably meet the standard starting in 2024. Still has to be certified to show that. And there will be more assurance measures associated with that new standard to ensure that the engine emissions systems are more durable, if you will, and fewer higher emitters and presumably less frequency of malfunction kind of thing. So starting in 2024, a combustion engine, a diesel and natural gas engine are expected to essentially be the same in terms of NOx. And that's already required by rules that have been adopted for all sales here. So, so I'm gonna make sure that's understood. So things are kind of evolving as we're trying to clean up all engines as much as possible and transition to zero emission to get that last reduction possible. Including GHG goals, but also meeting our criteria pollutant reduction goals and so on. So hopefully that helps. So I think the South Coast will recognize that too, is that in time things evolve and as engine standards change and things like that, plans have to be adjusted and that kind of goes together. I'll go ahead and I anticipate 1383 will come up some more. Yes, so we've looked into 1383. We are continuing to look at the situation. We do recognize that renewable gas is clearly being sold into transportation because of the LCFS program. But a recent decision by the PUC also now requires the utilities to purchase renewable gas for electricity production. And so that's now a new driver for pulling that RNG production into non-transportation sources. And so that's a relatively recent development. And yes, we are closely coordinating with our scoping plan efforts on ultimately what the overall state strategy is and how electrification and this particular rulemaking fits within that overall strategy, covering all categories, not just transportation, so industrial uses and so on. And so part of those modeling scenarios and part of that strategy is looking at how does the state meet its overall goals to get the maximum or to meet sustainability requirements or GHG reduction targets when you look at the entire picture, not just one segment. And so, yeah, we're definitely doing that and trying to make sure that we align this with the long-term plan, because ultimately these are long-term plans that we're talking about here. So I'll pause there, and then I'm sure we'll touch on some of the other comments.
Next in the queue of 16 to speak is Catherine Larson. Catherine, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Larson, and I'm with the Southern California Public Power Authority. Really, thank you for holding this workshop and especially for posting the draft regulatory language a week in advance. That was really helpful in starting to go through the draft and understand some of what's being contemplated in this current version. We will certainly plan to follow up with written questions, but we had some written comments rather, but we've got some clarifying questions to start with. And actually, I also do want to say, just like Nick from Aqua mentioned, we really appreciate CARB's efforts to respond to some of the key issues that we've raised in comments on the last draft rule, especially regarding the availability and emergency response needs. Our focus has really been trying to ensure that the ACF will have sufficient flexibility to protect against any kind of unintended consequences. So we do really appreciate the new exemption category for public fleets regarding ZEV availability and the mutual aid exemption, but we think the details will be very critical in making sure the exemptions are practical and work as intended. So in terms of my clarifying questions, the first one is really about commercial availability, not a defined term in the regulation for the draft rule that we saw, but it's very central to the ZEV unavailability exemption. And as a couple of the prior commenters touched on, supply quantities, the public bidding process, and costs are all factors that could affect whether or not an agency could actually purchase a vehicle in practice, delivery time as well. So the first question I had is, are these factors contemplated in commercial availability as you see it? And if they aren't, what kind of options would a public agency have if they can't purchase a commercially available vehicle in practice?
Yeah, appreciate that. And I'd actually like to have a little discussion. So our mindset is here that we're talking about the regulatory requirement is in essence a purchase requirement. So starting in 2050, it is 50% of the purchases would have to be zero emission. And so when the vehicle is delivered, isn't going to determine the compliance for the fleet. It's going to be based on the actual purchase. So if one truck takes a year to come and another one takes 2 or 3 years to come, but you've ordered 50% as zero emission, you are meeting the compliance requirement. So for those reasons, we don't believe that how long it takes to get the vehicle is going to present an issue where a fleet would be out of compliance when they've ordered the vehicles according to the.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that just before going on to the other elements? Or I think one of the issues that we've seen is that the lead time for some of our fleets trying to order, like the F-150 Lightnings, for instance, has been unknown or quite lengthy. And so if a fleet needs to purchase, if they're trying to replace a vehicle and the lead time for a ZEV is like 2 years out, they might really be limited in their options for what they could do in the interim if they need to replace a vehicle, but then the ZEV is multiple years out.
Okay. And then
that's the perspective.
Yeah, understood. Okay, appreciate that detail because that's a slightly different nuance. But so in this example, we're referring to, okay, a vehicle's been announced, it actually isn't being produced yet. And at this point, as my understanding is, there's been a number of pre-orders for the vehicle, but the production hasn't actually started. And so that's the situation that you're contemplating, right? As opposed to, no, the vehicle is widely available, but it takes 6 months or longer to get the vehicle, and then another year to put the body, and so it's going to take a year and a half before it's in service, or 2 years. That's a different situation. That's kind of status quo.
I think it's a little bit of both. We can touch on this more in comments, but if the time to get a ZEV delivered and then upfit is substantially longer, if it is substantially longer than its non-ZEV counterpart, that can be a factor. But that's something we can certainly explore in our comments in more detail.
Yeah, and then the other thing I'd like to just use this opportunity to mention, to the extent that there are nuanced issues, part of the purpose of the workshop is to identify some of the key issues, what we need to follow up with, potentially phone calls or meetings to kind of go over some details or more information is something we're also looking at as part of the taking the results of the workshop, the written comments, but also just following up on more detail than we can cover here at this meeting. So, we'll potentially follow up on some of these issues with different individuals as appropriate.
For the elements of, public bidding process or limited supply and practice and cost too, are those factors that you see as being part of the commercial availability definition? Is that still under consideration?
Yeah, I can say that in terms of cost itself, that generally no, we've avoided using cost as a benchmark specifically. The way we try to address that is to provide these flexibility options so that the fleets can kind of make their own business decisions as to what the best strategy is. So again, the provision to purchase early, for example, if you have added or do add make some purchases of zero emission trucks now, will allow you to count those towards your future requirement. So that if you're saying, hey, I'm ordering, technically this would work. If I'm ordering an F-150 that's in that class 2B category now, and in 2027, you're going to buy some more specialized crane or diesel vehicle, then at that point you can say, hey, I made a purchase early. I'm going to count it here so I can buy a diesel in 27 to give me that flexibility. And so those are some of the things that might encourage you to act now rather than wait until the rule actually kicks in. And so that's a mechanism. And then that's also the part of the rationale in terms of saying from 24 through up to 27, that 50% of purchases would be zero, so that again, a public fleet or agency can basically make that decision as to, it makes sense for us to electrify this half of our purchases, but the other half looks more challenging, so we're going to go with diesel or gasoline or whatever. So there's a few years to kind of give a little bit of flexibility there.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, and I think that still may be challenges for especially some of the smaller agencies with far more limited resources, but that's certainly something we can further look into. One related question on the ZEV unavailability exemption, sort of along the same lines, is there's potential exemption if certain conditions are met, including that a ZEV with equivalent configuration isn't available. And so one of the questions is, what do you mean, or what do you envision as an equivalent configuration? And if the agency specs doesn't exactly align with the ZEV listed, or rather the available ZEVs, whose determination of equivalent would be used.
Yeah, and so on some things like this, it's like, what our intent was, or our goal here, is to kind of streamline this approach so that if you need, I'm just going to use an example of a boom truck of some kind, and we put it on the list as boom trucks really aren't available in the class 4 through 8 category. I can't remember which category, or 7 and 8 category. At that point, you would just buy your diesel report once you got it delivered a year later or so, that you bought it because it was listed as exempt. And so you didn't have to go through any process per se to go ahead and make that purchase because it was on our list. And so the idea here is to also keep this a relatively straightforward approach. And so there's always a balance in how complex you make it. But our concept here is if it's a boom truck that you need and there's one available, but you prefer one manufacturer over another, that we don't want to accommodate something like that. If it'll do the work, it'll do the job, then you should buy it at zero emission. And then ultimately the basic configuration is kind of it's generally going to be the body type that you're putting on it. So if you have a service truck with service bays and compartments and so on, if you have electric vehicles in that category and they're available by at least one manufacturer or two body builders or whatever, then we consider it available. It won't be on this list and it wouldn't be eligible for an exemption. But if they're not being made or aren't available for whatever reason, we're also trying to make sure we're writing this in a way that vehicles that we don't know about at this point, if it comes to, hey, here's a pretty specialized vehicle, honestly, that we didn't isn't going to be a pretty standard configuration, is where we think this will happen the most, isn't available as zero emission for whatever reason, and it can't be electrified, then we would want to make sure that that just would be put on the list.
So your thinking is more that instead of having like a process, if the specs didn't match or what the need didn't match what was
what we're
going to be available, you'd add material to the list. Is that the thinking?
To use a kind of an example, I kind of used it with staff. I mean, so what we want to avoid are we want to minimize complexity, but also avoid loopholes, if you want to call them that. So if you spec a truck, say, hey, I need a service body that does X, Y, Z, they exist, but it's like, no, I want 4 cup holders and this truck only has 2. That wouldn't be a criteria we would want to use. So that's what we're trying to achieve here. And so obviously the language matters. And so any insight or in ways we can make this more clear, we would appreciate that. And then we clearly identified some of the vehicles that aren't going to be eligible for this, like box trucks and pickups and so on, because there are just so many already available. So there's really no expectation that you can't get one that you need.
Okay, thanks. I have a couple other questions I'm going to try to run through just quickly, so in the interest of giving everyone time to, but one more on the ZEV unavailability exemption, and this is a little bit in the weeds of the text, but on page 13, the section 213L3 says that the unavailability exemption is only available if the public fleet owner shows that all the remaining, combustion engine vehicles are either using an exemption or are unavailable in the ZEV configuration.
Right.
And so trying to understand what that means in practice, like if you've got a
Catherine, I'll jump in right now. That was a drafting error. We were trying as much as possible to make all parts of the regulation as identical as we could. And so on the high priority portion, they have a straight purchase requirement concept and a fleet average concept to meet milestones. And so unfortunately, this language was copied from that wrong section. So we'll fix that for sure. But in principle, it's you're buying, I'm just going to call it, use a crane as example. You're buying a crane and we put it on the list as not available. Then go ahead and buy the diesel crane and move on. When we're talking about a fleet average, it's a different situation where it's like, hey, you can meet a 10% ZEV target just because you have 5 vehicles out of 100 that might not be available today doesn't mean you can't meet your target. That's what this language was about. So unfortunately, we copied the wrong section in.
Thanks for the clarification. That makes a lot more sense to me in the context of the rest of the exemption.
Yeah.
One on mutual aid exemption, sure. Which is, do the vehicles that have an exemption or an extension count toward that 75% threshold for qualifying to use the exemption?
Yeah, I have to look at the language. Paul, going to help me here. Was it 75% of the vehicles need to be zero emission?
Yes, and before the exemption kicks in.
Okay, so I think as worded, the concept would be you have 100 vehicles. Once you've gotten to 75%, being actually zero emission, whether you have other exemptions or not, then that's the time that you can come in and say, hey, I've got these mutual aid agreements. I need to keep a quarter of my fleet as going to be diesel. So as I'm making these purchases, I'm going to buy diesel and not zero emission because the conditions that we laid out wouldn't be met. And so the conditions were, in essence, that that there would be some, essentially we're trying to write it as there would be some risk that you wouldn't be able to provide support during an emergency event if you electrified your entire fleet. And part of the criteria there is that mobile fueling, if it's available, that shouldn't present any issue with supporting an emergency event anywhere in the US for that matter. So that's kind of the intent there.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I think we're still thinking through that one a little bit and the ramifications.
Yeah, well, and while we're on it, just because I think this will benefit others as well. On the mutual aid provision is, again, allowing you to buy combustion vehicles in the event that you might be called out for an emergency event. We also have language in the regulation to deal with emergency events so that any vehicle can come into the state, and some of these vehicles and other fleets can be used for emergency events during that time period. And in here, and for unlimited miles, if you will. And so if there are some vehicles that were essentially being kept as backup vehicles, for instance, with using an exception to the basic requirement, those vehicles could also be used as much as possible during an emergency event, and so it wouldn't count against you. So there's two aspects to it. It's these agreements that you might be called out versus any natural disaster and immediate threat to public safety, that there's provisions to allow use of non-compliant vehicles, if you will, to support that event.
Okay, thank you. And the last question I'll ask for now is just, it was touched on, I think, by the prior commenter. A number of SCAPAS members are also subject to the South Coast rules, including 1196, and generally speaking, that requires fleets to purchase non-diesel alternatives. There's also a sort of lengthy multi-step technical and feasibility exemption process you can go through as well. One of the issues that our folks are dealing with or thinking about is having to go through these separate exemption processes that aren't necessarily aligned. They might they require sets of different documentation or different steps, might really complicate or extend the budgeting and procurement processes for some of these vehicles. And so just wanted to ask to what extent, you guys have been in conversation with the South Coast folks on how these interact and, the different exemption processes, for instance, how they might work together.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I can say, I mean, we've discussed the rule concept in general, but not at the level of detail that you're referring to here, because it is an alternative fuel vehicle purchase requirement, which zero emission vehicles meet that definition. So we presume that was fairly straightforward. The concept here of the unavailable vehicle list, I think was a comment from, I think she's in the meeting today, but from C, but I think it was building on what the South Coast has done in terms of their list of what's not available, as I think natural gas was the focus in the past. So it's a similar concept, but I suppose with that, I mean, we can go back and kind of see how do these align and how would they approach the same issues when we're talking about zero emission, because zero emission is an alternative fuel vehicle as well. And there's, as we've kind of touched on, there's more and more becoming available, every month, it seems like nowadays. So that'll have to be a follow-up item for us, but any comments there that are appreciated too.
All right, next in line to speak is David Rothbart. David, I've unmuted your line, you may speak.
It shows that you're muted on your end, David. So.
Oh, thank you. Good morning. I'm David Rothbart. I'm the Air Quality Committee Chair for SCAP. I also work for the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. The sanitation districts provide wastewater treatment services for 5.6 million people in Los Angeles County, and we treat about 400 million gallons per day of sewage, which produces a waste gas or a biomethane that can be used for renewable fuels. I'm concerned that the proposed advanced clean fleet regulation doesn't provide a home for this biogas that's produced. Tony, you had responded to an earlier question that seemed to suggest that the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation would allow renewable natural gas to be used in vehicles, which is very encouraging, but right now the language doesn't say that. Can you answer that? And then I have a couple other questions.
Okay, well, I did not mean to imply that this rule would increase or foster the expansion of use of renewable gas in vehicles. I mean, the goal here is transition to all zero emission or zero emission capable vehicles over time, but we're talking about a couple of decades here, the transition realistically. So you'll be able to continue operating your existing vehicles for a number of years or decades actually. And obviously with the 50% purchase requirement starting in 24, the other 50% could be anything, which could be natural gas, diesel, gasoline.
I understand where you're coming from. And this is like, just realize that the waste water treatment sector, we're going to be here forever. As long as people flush their toilets, we're going to need to provide a home for that biogas, and especially 1383, we're going to take food waste out of landfills, reduce those greenhouse gas emissions, and use it productively to generate something that's a renewable fuel. But the disconnect we're having here, and this is the problem we've been kind of asking to be resolved, is we need a home for this biogas that will be generated forever. We want to flare it. We want to use it in a productive sense. And because of attainment and many other regulations, we're not finding a home for it. We sense from CARB that you want us to put it in the pipeline. We appreciate SB 1440 that provides a home for some of the gas, but I really want to emphasize that is a minor amount of the gas could find a home in that pathway, because there's many other regulatory barriers that limit how much gas could go to the pipeline. And we really need you to understand that and work with you to get to the point where we find a home for that gas in a productive sense. And to us, as far as attainment, it goes to how to cleanly use this fuel, and putting it into vehicles makes a lot of sense to us, especially when you look at the life cycle analysis of what the greenhouse gas emissions would be for an electric vehicle versus taking local biogas generated from a wastewater treatment plant, putting it in a Cummins Westport engine for renewable natural gas. It's as clean, if not cleaner, than an electric vehicle when you look at mining and international transport. It's just something we really need to talk to you guys about. And, a more direct question for you, Tony, is one of your slides, I think slide 4, talked about attainment. And this is something I live with in the South Coast Air Basin. When we're not going to attain the 2023 standard in the South Coast, and the Clean Air Act specifically says there are penalties that are placed upon major stationary sources. My organization is going to be paying about $1 million a year until we come into attainment. Having those diesel trucks on the road for a long time is just going to make us pay those fees forever. And maybe people don't worry about the stationary sources. The other thing that I'd really like to answer for is the Clean Air Act says that federal highway funding is going to be withheld. So does CARB have some agreement? Have you talked to EPA as far as what happens when South Coast and other air districts don't attain what we're going to do in that situation?
So in terms of the last comment, no, I'm not clear. I'm not in the position to actually know what kind of discussions are occurring in terms of attainment of potential penalties and so on. So I don't have any information there. But you're getting at a point with it, but I'm not sure what the point is. Because we're starting in 2024 with this particular requirement. There's a number of other efforts in place, and as you may know, and we touched on, the truck and bus regulation, for instance, requires non-public fleets in essence, but all diesel trucks to upgrade to 2010 engines, because when the rule was adopted back in 2008, they were the cleanest foreseeable engine at the time. And so that'll make a significant dent, but still not going to get us into attainment.
Agreed. And the reason I bring it up is in the past, in the SIP, CARB agreed to over 100 ton per day reduction in NOx in South Coast. And I believe I heard CARB's not able to do that. So it's sort of in that light of how do we deal with reducing NOx as quickly as possible, and you're getting co-benefits, reduce greenhouse gases and NOx at the same time. In my simplistic view, looking at all the tools in the toolbox and say, how do we get to clean air as quickly as possible? The wastewater sector is part of that solution. We have a renewable gas that could be used now that is much cleaner than other alternatives. And we're trying to work with you and other regulators to find a way to use that gas productively. And it seems to help the attainment problem immediately and also helps your greenhouse gas goals as well. So I just, my request, and maybe Tony, you can answer this, can we sit down and get all the regulatory decision makers in one room and try to figure out a pathway forward?
I don't know who we can specifically coordinate, but yes, we can sit down and have a discussion for sure. I just don't know if who all the parties that need to be involved, because but this does tie back to a degree to the scoping plan as well. And I kind of want to touch on some of the points you raised there too. I mean, so the scoping plan does look at the kind of the entire picture, not just transportation, and is looking at those kinds of questions of, hey, where are the best uses of the various fuels? Yes, we don't want, we do want you to keep doing what you're doing and trap those gases that would otherwise escape and use them for something useful. The question really becomes, how is the state going to meet its objectives most effectively, and where that fuel is ultimately directed, and what options there are for different source categories like industrial, residential, transportation, and other things are all part of that picture. And so to make sure we also don't talk kind of past each other either. You know, when you're saying, hey, the renewable gas is providing reductions, it's actually required or is happening because of the LCFS regulation today. And I think with the PUC decision, there's now an economic incentive or advantage to making it available for electricity production, for instance. But there's still the question about these other sources and what the best strategy is. So, and I kind of want to cover this too, as I kind of went over it just the other day. It's, as you may be aware, I mean, so the renewable fuels, renewable diesel, renewable gas, that's all part of LCFS, is lowering the carbon intensity of California fuels overall, transportation overall. And so that's where natural gas is currently fitting in today. But we're not achieving more than what LCFS is already achieving, whether it's applied to transportation and or some other application if it's the same amount of fuel being used. And so that's kind of where the complexity kind of comes in. It's how do you balance that? And so we're not saying that there aren't benefits, it's we just can't count the same benefit twice. And so when you're saying we're getting additional reductions, like those are reductions already expected because of LCFS. Electrification actually goes beyond what LCFS was anticipating, and is a different animal too. And so all of these are part of meeting a system goal overall.
And I totally agree with what you just said, the system goal. But as you can see, we could go on for hours about this. I don't want to take any more time, let other people chime in. But I think overall, what I'm saying is, because of attainment requirements, all the gas we're going to generate for existing wastewater treatment, people flushing their toilets, and SB 1383, we don't have a pathway forward. There's no place for that gas to go. It can't all go in the pipeline, especially when you're saying we want to get rid of fossil fuels. That pipeline is not something that's going to be there in the capacity necessary for us. So I'll leave it at that and let other people comment, but we do want to sit down and work the bugs out as far as what to do with this gas moving forward.
I guess I'll hop in for a moment here. I'm getting some comments from some other members of our team. I guess one question we have broadly, we are thinking about renewable hydrogen as another option for this biogas, as a pathway to take this biogas, turn into low carbon renewable hydrogen, and that could be a potential pathway. I guess we may not have time to discuss this. We are interested in knowing like what if that's a feasible pathway for you and your organization, or what barriers are in place. So we could talk about that, I guess, more in the future, and maybe have a further discussion with our infrastructure team, but that would help, because it is something we're trying to look into agency-wide, and there's a lot of questions, so we just want to better understand that pathway as well.
And I appreciate that, and we're happy to talk to you about it. The short answer is we have not found a pathway that works reliably for an essential public service to go to hydrogen. We're happy to work with you and work on demonstrations, but it's not available yet.
Okay, so David, yeah, we'll look to schedule a meeting, and I guess while we're on the topic, since it might come up, I mean, the remember that under this particular regulation, I mean, we got the public fleet portion, but the high priority and drayage, we're targeting a lot of trucks and a lot of the fleet, but not all of it. So there's still a segment of the population that isn't necessarily going to transition to zero emission with this given rule. That is an ultimate goal, but that's another, you know, we kind of need to do this in bite-sized pieces is the approach we're taking.
Thank you. Well, we'll look forward to working with you.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.
Next in line to speak is Amber Caluso. Amber, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Hi, this is Amber Caluso with the City of Los Angeles Harbor Department, also known as the Port of Los Angeles. So I'm more of a comments rather than a question. So the City of Los Angeles as a whole is committed to accelerating zero emission vehicles with the Green New Deal. And it's set the goals of fleet changeover at 25% by 2025, 80% by 2035, and 100% by 2050. And the port, we've already started the process for adding 70 dual port EV charging stations earlier this year, but we're not expected to have that project completed until June 30th of 2025 because of all of the supply chain and everything else that's happening. So a 1-year extension for infrastructure is not enough for us. It's going to need to be a little bit more than that, just because we need to bring more power to the port. We are having to electrify more than just EVs. We have to electrify our the cargo handling equipment here, the ships that are plugging in at berth. We're in the middle of trying to get DWP to get us power for a zero emission locomotive testing, and they aren't even able to give us that. So we need more time. So my suggestion would be to have the milestones be a little bit adjusted, especially with the supply chain as it is. And so my suggestion would be 25% purchases in January 2025, January 2030, 50%, and then January 1st, 2035 at 100%. So it kind of matches up more with existing policies and regulations, because you already have the drayage trucks at 2035 as well. So it makes more sense for everybody to kind of be all on the same page a little bit more.
Okay, so Amber, you're presenting a lot of questions for me, even without making the comment. So we are going to be discussing the drayage truck requirements on Friday. So I presume you'll be part of that. But
yes.
You are suggesting here for the public portion or the state and local government fleet to change the phase-in schedule, the purchase schedule. And you're saying 100% makes it the same as drayage by 2035, but I want to make sure we're talking the same language. The drayage part is a full conversion by 2035, not just start making purchases at that point. So they'll be 100% electric by that point in time. Under the drayage part. And if you just started doing 100% of purchases as zero emission at that far out, the fleet would probably only be at 10 to 15% zero emission by 2035. And that is not going to be consistent with the executive order and the various directives, nor even attainment goals that we have as well. So that's a huge difference to set a purchase requirement versus a fleet transition requirement.
Okay. Well, we're just not going to be able to get the infrastructure for a lot of this equipment.
Right. No, I understand that point.
If you don't mind, so
I'm sorry. If you don't mind, I missed the detail. What's the project at this point that you referred to? Was how many?
We're putting in 70 dual port EV chargers, so that's 140 charging ports for EV. Okay. And we started the project. They're starting the project. This process for the project a couple months ago, but they're not estimating the completion of this until June 30th of 2025, because we still, as a public agency, we have to go to bid, and then we have to the selection process, then design, then ordering the parts, and the part orders right now, because of the supply chain, is taking twice as long as what it would normally be. And then actual construction, which requires CEQA for us, because but even if we have, anytime we have to dig anything, we have to check for contamination, historical, anything like that, and then the actual supply of the power, and then finish it out. So it takes us like it normally what would have been 18 months is now taking us 3 years.
Got it. Okay.
So 1 year construction is not going to be enough for us.
Thank you.
Okay, next in line to speak is Stephen Poncelay. Stephen, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Yes, hello, this is Stephen Poncelay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. I'm not quite sure how to make my camera come on or I'd show it, but I'll keep going. Thank you, Tony, Craig, and Paul and Harinder for the information and engagement with us. Truly appreciate that. I'm with Truckee Donner Public Utility District. We're a small electric, community-owned, not-for-profit electric and water utility in Truckee, California, near Lake Tahoe. I have spoken to this group, to staff and others before regarding, our unique situation. We're a small utility. Our fleet is multi-purpose. We deal with a lot of snow and storms and restoration. So a couple things. We are predominantly in Nevada County. However, we have a hanging chad in Placer County that happens to be the other side of Donner Lake. Looks just like the Nevada County side, except for it happens to be in Placer County, but we're 90+% in Nevada County. But the regulation states for a low county exemption, you have to be solely within that county, which in our case seems a little unfair. Could you comment on that?
I see your point, I guess. I mean, so we and that's, again, the details do matter, but yeah, we were looking at the general expectation that many of these jurisdictions are going to have pretty well-defined boundaries, and that we would simply use that as a criteria. And as you see on the map here, these are going to tend to be more of the rural areas that maybe it's going to take a little longer for infrastructure development and so on to occur. And so that was all part of the thinking, and ultimately that some of these would be expected to be smaller municipalities, more spread out, to have varied terrain, much more so than the others. And even though I did use the term rural, the Central Valley air quality problems and so on, we need to do everything we can there. So that's kind of the thinking around that. So your situation sounds very specific. I mean, I think that's something we can take back and discuss, is how to do that for somebody that might have, like you're saying, a sliver of their service territory outside the red regions, I suppose.
Sure. And in our case, it really looks just like the other rural part. It just happened, and for special districts and, non-counties or munis, you'll run into this. Thank you. There was a statement made earlier, and I do echo what Nick from Aqua and Sarah from CASA and Catherine from SCAPA have been talking about in terms of essential services and critical response. The regulations talk about declared emergency as a trigger. And I can tell you that Truckee Donner PUD in the last 5 years has responded to, major outages, major storms, major blizzards, major floods, been out there all night long, had our fleet and staff going day and night. We have only had 2 declared emergencies in 5 years. So using declared emergency as a threshold, formal declared emergency, a la county activates the off their OES, is kind of a hard hurdle for water, wastewater, electric, where every time the power, the water, the sewer goes out, it's an emergency from a public health and safety point of view, but not, rarely rises to the scale and scope of a declared emergency. So I'm curious if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so I mean, so the part of the language for the declared emergency and so on is we pulled it from previously existing rules. We've used it a number of times, and it's worked well, I think, in those provisions. One of the things we're trying to do, and so that's a relatively straightforward way to address, these events, fires and earthquake, flood, different situations like that. What we're trying to find a balance here is to identify situations where the early electrification may present a risk, but not to necessarily just provide another mechanism to say, don't electrify when electric vehicles may be as good or better in some cases than combustion vehicles for meeting a need or a daily activity, if you want to call it that. We're trying to be responsive to, hey, I mean, clearly this is a change in vehicle technology. It is a transition. There are things to be done, but there's always pros and cons with different kinds of vehicles. And if you can more than adequately meet your public safety needs and so on with electric vehicles, then there would be no reason for a provision. And if for some reason there was an inherent risk or associated risk, then that's something we would like to address to minimize that potential.
Okay.
So yeah, because I mean we've spoken to a number of entities and it's like, hey, our service area is 10 square miles and we never leave this area and we deal with whatever it is, pipes breaking or some other things, but there's really no reason electric vehicles wouldn't be more suitable for those needs, especially given the long transition that we have. And so if that's the case, then there's no reason not to electrify. But if there's a significant or an associated significant risk where they might not be suitable, then we would like to be able to address that.
Great, thank you. Our example is we're also 10 miles by 4 miles. In our December storms, our vehicles went 2 miles and then stayed in the field for 8 days. Crews rotated in and out. We brought in Roseville Electric Mutual Response, got them into a neighborhood and fueled them in the field. So getting to the job site with an electric vehicle, if it had a rugged four-wheel drive chassis, wouldn't be the problem.
Mhm.
Operating it in the field for days on end with shore power, or most of our vehicles are PTO, power takeoff. And batteries, in the electric world, we talk batteries in 4 and 8 hour increments, not in 4 and 8 hour days. So our ability to function in the field with pumps and motors and cranes and everything else that goes with restoring electric and water is critical for us. One comment I wanted to make on exemptions for snow removal equipment. We need it. Truckee Donner PUD had restored power to our system in the December blizzards days before the town of Truckee had roads cleared, because we removed snow to get to our equipment. And we do not have a single piece of dedicated snow removal equipment in our all 18 special districts in town, and don't have that here. It doesn't exist. All our vehicles are multi-purpose. We take off blades and blowers and we replace them in the summer with dump trucks and pumps and whatever we need to do. So we've made this comment before, but under the current regulation, we will be incapable of reaching the job site, yet alone having the power to do the work on site. So I'm curious if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm interested in a little bit more detail and ultimately how this factors into a phase-in strategy as well. So one, we need to address it, but some of these comments are in part, if you're at 10%, 15% of your vehicles are electric, you obviously can have some choices as to which ones you electrify. You're still going to have those vehicles for some significant period of time. And so then when we're talking about, getting to half your fleet being a zero emission, we're talking almost 10 years from now. And then vehicle capability, refueling capabilities, and so on are expected to be considered better. So we're trying to find a good balance there, and that's where some of the how a fleet would transition would be part of that.
I appreciate that. My concern is this is going to split into large fleet, small fleets. because the bigger fleets and, have more resources and more flexibility, but the smaller fleets, it gets really tough. And I know you guys don't want to do that, but as written as a small fleet, we're really looking to work with you to make improvements. And I'll go quickly because I want to give time to other people. I was going to ask about ZEV and NZEV unavailability and the delivered component of that, but I think you answered it was ordered, not delivered was the criteria for compliance. But I would encourage you to delve down Catherine Larson's comments from SCAPA about 2 years delivery. It's not just on new, not yet produced. There's vehicles that have been on the market for a few years and it's a two-year lead time. And sometimes that won't work for critical, if maybe a package wouldn't get delivered, we can live with that, but the lights and the water and the sewer, when we need the vehicle, that's a big thing. And then you did talk about the funding. So, I'll end, Tony, with, as a critical infrastructure emergency response public health and safety agency, I appreciate that there's a path for saying the vehicle doesn't exist. My concern is you're going to have 1,000 examples of that swamping you from just water, sewer, and electric, because if it doesn't exist, then we have to do it. So we're looking for advice from you on how can we best interact with CARB staff to get our concerns over and create something that meets the state goals, which we support very much, but doesn't overwhelm CARB staff nor the utilities.
Yeah. So, well, I one of the first and most obvious is I wanted to say is if you wouldn't mind providing some written comments, whether it's just an email or a letter or something to the effect that kind of identifies some of the items you've addressed, including some of the details about your snow removal activities, for example, the types of vehicles and so on. That would be helpful because I know we've spoken in the past, but I don't recall exactly how many vehicles you have and what types and that kind of thing.
Sure.
So that would be helpful. And then even in terms of, if you have ideas on say, hey, how do we make this, what the provisions we put in here, how do we make them better or more clear? Or even, and frankly, honestly, that some of these categories where you say, hey, these vehicles don't exist or won't, picture is usually quite helpful to kind of say, yeah, here's the type of vehicle. Because you see on this particular slide, we identified some vehicle categories that are relatively broad, but we said, hey, these are not going to be part of the ZEV purchase requirement right now. And having said that, I know that at this point that there are electric cranes that are some of these pretty big ones that are already available, for example. And so if we can readily identify, hey, there's some other vehicles that are fairly unique or something along those lines, and we could identify them now, then that might be one way to address it. Otherwise, it'll be, maybe we can improve the way the language works to make this more straightforward. The whole idea was to do a streamlined approach as to what's available, what's not. But part of that was to make it streamlined would be to be somewhat simplified to a degree. So we're not going to get into every single spec, but the key specification for a vehicle, we would expect to largely be met for whatever its purpose is. So anything that anyone can provide in terms of comments or ways to improve it. Actually, I want to make one more comment. So you can post your comments online. They'll be available for everybody to see. If for any reason you want to provide us information without necessarily putting it online for everybody else to see, you can still email us that, or we can have a phone call or a meeting too as needed on any nuances as well. So those are other mechanisms that we can use to get a better understanding of what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Next in line to speak is Bradley Northup. Bradley, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
All right. My name is Bradley Northup. I'm with the NAFA Pacific Southwest Chapter of Fleet Management Association. I do have a few items to talk about today, namely in regards to timeline, the construction delay exemption, unavailability exemption, as well as mutual aid. I do want to note that the NAFA Fleet Management Association submitted a memo regarding a lot of these areas back in October and November timeframe, as requested in response to other meetings. I also want to say thank you very much to everybody on the CARB team for working with us over the last year and a half and holding extra work groups and individual work groups with fleet management teams. My first question or first concern still has to do with the timeline for public fleets and compliance. These discussions began over a year and a half ago, and there's still a lot to be discussed about specifics and how public fleets can comply. However, we do not see the 2024 mark moving forward in retrospect to that. Public fleets do have a harder time when it comes to public works contracting code, solicitation requirements, notices to the public of public works projects, as well as soliciting and identifying funding from the public agency in a timely manner to make infrastructure itself available for compliance, as well as the availability of certain vehicles may not be available for the type of conversion that those fleets can target within the time frame. So to reiterate the NAFA memo from October, we would implore the CARB board and your team to evaluate a different start date for public fleets, albeit they may still have a same end result date that you're targeting, but then giving us a little bit more time for the infrastructure up front to be able to comply. Perhaps not a 2024 start date purchase requirement, since we're not going to be able to buy vehicles without infrastructure at least targeting and getting in place, but also being able to make sure that we have enough time for the infrastructure projects to begin and go through public contracting and solicitation phases. My second comment has to do with the construction delay. This was something that was identified as part of an infrastructure concern from NAFA in our letter, and it was namely specific to the delays for specific sites in certain locations that there is a delay in utility. I just like a little bit more clarification on that exemption for the construction delay, whether or not a construction project has to be awarded and in progress before you can claim that exemption.
In principle, yes. The idea was that, hey, you've started a construction project and then something unforeseen essentially happened that put you behind schedule. And we kind of list a number of items that would be the reason for that unexpected delay. And the idea there is that you would be able to postpone, if you will, any ZEVs that would be delivered that is going to be dependent on that infrastructure, so that you don't ultimately have it delivered and not being able to use it because the infrastructure is not ready.
Okay,
but
and it does.
Yeah, and sorry. Actually, I wanted to bring up an issue that related to the prior comment too, but also related here. Is that we also recognize there's going to be some lead time, both for the vehicle and the infrastructure. So as you're mentioning, you don't need the infrastructure to be available January 1, 24, I'm sorry, if you're just ordering the vehicle, because it's realistically going to be a year. And then depending on the vehicle type, it could be 2 years or more. If anybody is submitting comments, I'd be very interested, and I want you to be mindful of letting us know too, is how long does it take to normally get a diesel or gasoline vehicle? Because again, when I say 2 years, that's not unusual for any kind of work truck, whether it's diesel or zero emission. And in some cases, the zero emission ones can be delivered faster than diesel. So when we're talking 2 years and so on, I don't think that's specific to a zero emission vehicle per se. It's really about just the time it takes to spec and order to the vehicle and then ultimately get the body upfitted, for example. But putting those in context is very helpful for us.
Yeah, I would like to follow up to that first part in timelines for public fleets. As it is right now, the 2024 requirement essentially has, especially most public fleets are on a fiscal year cycle of July 1, puts fleets at a burden to have all these decisions made around the same time that CARB is even entertaining the approval of this regulation, which has every public agency reworking their capital project programs and their purchase requirements for the next year. And namely, if you're not already expecting that this regulation is going to be approved and acting as if it is approved, then any public fleet not acting in that manner is already behind the ball. And I think that's what there's frustration with, is there's a lot of public entities out there. We're all answering to the taxpayer and the city council and the board members. You know, there's no regulation here yet to force us to do this. So yes, we're trying to be preemptive, but that doesn't guarantee that something's actually going to be approved.
Right.
So when a 2024 requirement comes through, we're ultimately reworking an existing budget to make sure that our purchase requirements are meeting the reporting requirement for 2024.
Well, I want to make sure we're also talking the same language, because the details matter a lot. So if you're saying, hey, we're doing a bid process in the middle of 23, and we're going to make those contracts or purchase agreements or and place vehicle orders, let's just say in November, December of 23, then there's, to me, the rule hasn't started yet and it hasn't applied yet. So now you're back to June of 24 and you're making purchase decisions. At that point, those purchases are the ones that count towards that purchase requirement. So at that point, you're 50% of the purchases being made the subsequent year or in the middle of 24 would be affected there.
I'm speaking more to the public entities budgeting processes and allocation of the identified funds.
Okay.
So when we're talking about budgets being built up for vehicles,
Okay.
right? Electric vehicles are not always the right cost. You know, if we're building up budgets for the replacement of 35 pickup trucks, and those pickup trucks are budgeted at a $50,000 each cost, if they're all electric for a pickup truck, that could be upwards of $65,000 per vehicle after upfitting and configuration, right? There's a cost increase over the base gasoline configuration. So unless there's some other type of consideration that the fleet themselves can then use as an incentive or funding to offset that purchase, the budget itself is going to be impacted. And the city councils, the board members, they're not going to be entertaining additional money, especially in this environment, for something that's not yet regulation.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
I would like to just touch very briefly on, since I don't want to take way too much time here, the unavailability exemption.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, I want to make sure that there's some consideration when it comes to public agencies and the requirement of we are the good stewards of the taxpayers' money. And although there may be a example of a vehicle out there that meets your ZEV requirement, it may only be one manufacturer that's offering that vehicle type or configuration, in which case that vehicle type and configuration we do not and cannot identify that that manufacturer, that selection is a good value or a best value for the taxpayer at that point. So please just keep in mind that adding something into that exemption where the vehicles are available from multiple manufacturers is going to help public fleets in identifying in irrefutable terms that vehicles are available for those terms for being able to perform those functions. I would like to also, though, influence and refer back to the NAFA fleet management letter drafted and submitted in October regarding duty cycles of vehicles. Mr. Stephen Poncelay identified the same issues with vehicle travel isn't always the assessment of the function of a vehicle. The amount of miles that it travels is not always the assessment of the duty cycle that vehicle is performing, and the class size of the vehicle, especially when we're talking about electric vehicles here, is not always identifying the capability of that vehicle. Namely, electric batteries weigh a lot more than an internal combustion engine or even a diesel engine at a certain point. So we lose payload on certain configurations. So a vehicle that may be an F-350 that's got a utility body, 3/4 ton chassis as a conventional configuration with the diesel engine has a payload of 5,000 pounds. If you're looking at a comparative selection with the same, or at least around 100-mile configuration range, our payload is substantially reduced because of the weight of those batteries. So the functionality of the vehicle really still needs to be part of the consideration when we talk about exemptions over availability. We can't take an F-350 that had the capacity to have a utility body and tools and travel 100 miles every couple of days and compare it to something that can only hold half as much weight in capacity. So we have to be considerate about functionality of vehicles when we talk about the exemptions here. Last but not least, the mutual aid assistance. NAPA made a suggestion about redefining emergency vehicles, specifically for what Stephen even mentioned about public safety and public health. When we have public agencies that are responding to non-declared incidents, and for that matter, it could be middle of the night response for a water main break. That's not necessarily a declared emergency. However, there are multiple vehicles, namely pickup trucks and heavy equipment that are responding to an event such as that, that have an impact to public safety. And in the area of natural disaster, when you kind of bring that mutual aid assistance factor into it, not all of those scenarios are identified in mutual aid agreements. Mutual aid agreements are fairly specific in what they respond to and what agencies are being partnered into. So I commend the board and this team for considering all of these exemptions and adding them in. It's a good start. I think we still have some work to do to kind of finalize out how they're going to work for us, because we do understand that there's certain exemptions and identifications that were kind of pulled from other regulation. But those other regulations aren't talking about converting an entire fueling type across an industry. So thank you very much for letting me speak, and happy to hand it off to anybody else.
Thank you.
All right, next in line to speak is Stephen Jepsen, and just we have 24 attendees, 25 attendees with their hands raised, and I don't know if we want to take a short to transition to the next slides, or if you want to keep moving forward.
Yeah, let's
we'll
go ahead.
Stephen for now.
Let's say, yeah, let's take like at least 3 or 4 more, and then we can then continue on the slide deck and then go back to the discussion.
Stephen Jepsen, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
Thank you. Oh, excuse me. This is Steve Jepsen, the Executive Director for the Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works, or SCAP. We represent over 80 public water, wastewater, and recycled water agencies in Southern California. You already heard from David Rothbart, the SCAP Air Committee Chair, and also Sarah Delorier with CASA. I want to echo those comments and appreciate the opportunity to have this unique form of dialogue rather than just purely comments today. Stephen Poncelay with Truckee raised excellent points, and all the water, wastewater utilities deal with the same challenges that Stephen expressed, except for not all of us deal with the snow or having an extremely small fleet. But it's important to understand that we're responding to the prevention of emergencies regularly while people are sleeping or during the day. There's all kinds of utility minor to major crises that require these extreme duty cycles of vehicles. So, we talk about availability of electric trucks. There are Class 8, the largest truck available, fully electric. And these are what a lot of our specialized equipment are built on, Class 8 truck chassis. In talking to one of the major sewer truck maintenance manufacturers, National Signal, the calculations of published battery capacity for a Class 8 truck reveal that if we were using full vacuum and pumping, the battery would last about an hour. Our emergencies last anywhere from 8 hours to days. So clearly there's an issue there. The other, as David talked about, is by treating human waste, we generate this methane gas, renewable gas, that can't be turned off, and it needs a home. And we're struggling to understand the disconnect between we need a home for this gas. We also need vehicles that aren't available with full electric power. And we can use this gas to power these vehicles and expedite getting diesel trucks off the road while still providing the reliability for public service and environmental safety that we're striving for. We've heard a mention about pipeline injection. There are about 300 publicly owned treatment works in the state. 2 are doing pipeline injection. While SB 1440 helps this through procurement requirements, there are other regulatory and geographical challenges that make pipeline injection simply not practical for many locations. So that's not a one-size-fits-all solution at all, not even close. The utility sector, especially the wastewater sector, we rely on redundancy to protect public, double, triple redundancy. We need multiple pathways for the gas that's generated. And vehicle fuel, which is very clean, especially when compared to diesel, is an excellent pathway. And it'll allow us to continue serving the public. It seems like there's consideration for this in the scoping plan. So it's puzzling why the advanced complete rule isn't consistent with the scoping plan. And finally, I'll stop so other people can comment. But we really do encourage more meetings with various regulatory agencies like CPUC, CARB, EPA, and CalRecycle when discussing options for wastewater sector. The wastewater sector needs to be at the table so we can convey what the possibilities and limitations are. So with that, I'll stop and thank you for the comment. And I'm interested to hear if there's a response to some of these comments from CARB staff.
I'll make a request. You identified vehicles that were had really high utilization, or I forgot the term, extreme duty cycles is what you phrased it as.
Sure, yeah.
So to the extent that you do submit comments or others submit comments, identifying what those may be and frankly how many of those may be part of your fleet would be pretty helpful for us to understand what the best way to address that concern might be.
Happy to do that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Next in line to speak is Christian Corby. Christian, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Christian Corby. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the California Electric Transportation Coalition. And I'll keep my comments fairly brief because a lot of commenters have kind of already run over this ground. But I do want to start off by thanking CARB staff for their hard work on trying to build in some flexibility into the regulation, and specifically the vehicle availability exemption, which kind of I certainly appreciate it. It's not kind of exactly what CalETC had been advocating before about kind of a technology review process, but it's very similar. So I really appreciate the effort that went into creating this and trying to make it as streamlined as possible. I do want to just maybe ask or see if you could kind of direct me to additional background or analysis around why the exemption wouldn't apply to kind of specific truck types. I guess as some of the other commenters have reiterated, there's a lot of different use cases that some trucks are going to be put through, and it would be, I think it could be useful for the list maybe not to exempt certain large categories and just kind of have the list stand on its own, because obviously the only list that, or the only vehicles that wouldn't need to be purchased would be those that are on the list. So but anyway, so I just kind of I'd like to kind of hear a little bit more about that, and yeah, would definitely emphasize that it's it's going to be kind of down to use case in a lot of scenarios as opposed to what's written on the spec sheet. So yeah, just really appreciate all the robust discussion and CARB staff willingness to work with fleets on this. So thank you.
So in terms of your comment about so I think it's a second bullet on the page there, or the first sub bullet. Those list of vehicle types are essentially widely available in all kinds of configurations. And so we just put them on the list to say, yeah, let's not, this is part of part of our effort to try to streamline. It's like there's really no issue with putting a box on the back of any size vehicle. For instance, pickups are just coming multiple versions, extremely high range capabilities. Number of these have, some of them have in-wheel motors, but almost all of them have four-wheel drive. There's just really no foreseeable reason that a pickup that does 300 to 500 miles isn't going to meet your needs. So it's like, let's not have a debate about that. Let's focus on the categories of where, hey, there might be a digger derrick or some other configuration that might not be available in the near term as a zero emission one. And let's focus on those. So that was part of the attempt to kind of make this a little more streamlined and to reduce the potential time of focusing on vehicles that are already ubiquitous, if you will. So that was kind of the goal there. So again, we're looking to try to find that best balance. Keep it straightforward, simple. You know, when somebody identifies, hey, here's a vehicle that I need and really doesn't exist, that should be a fairly straightforward determination. Hopefully, it doesn't cover absolutely everything, but at minimum, if you can't buy it in the configuration you need, then you wouldn't have to spend any more time on it and move on during that, as long as it's not available.
Yeah, and I absolutely appreciate that, and I think it would be useful for other stakeholders, myself included, to kind of just see, you know, like, for example, for pickups, like how, like let's see kind of like how many different manufacturers are building them, what all of the different various types of pickups are there available. And for example, like, yeah, I think one of the commenters said before, like if there's just one, you know, manufacturer making a specific type, does that technically make it available, commercially available? And I think that would kind of go, I think the other one that jumps out at me is going to be the tractors one too. I think there's a large variety of different kinds of tractors that while, yeah, many drayage trucks are being purchased right now, but for different use cases, is that something that's going to be able to be technically considered commercially available? So that's all. Just kind of wondering, like, a little bit more of the criteria that would create a commercially available group that's that kind of broad.
Okay. Yeah, and so if anybody identifies anything more specialized, if you will, it's like, yeah, we put tractors here, but there's, I guess it depends on what people refer to them. I mean, a car carrier has literally many of them are carrying the cars on what would normally be called a tractor, but it's actually part of the truck at that point. So there are some items I think that we could probably nuance, but if there are some specific situations that the way we've addressed this doesn't cover it, and it is a situation where the configuration isn't going to be available, then you know, bring those to our attention so we can figure out how to make modifications to cover that potential situation.
All right, next in line out of 23 left attendees with their hands up is Frank Harris. Frank, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
That's great. Thank you very much. My name is Frank Harris. I'm with the California Municipal Utilities Association, represent publicly owned electric utilities as well as public water and wastewater agencies throughout the state of California. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk. And I wanted to add on to my others, thanking you for some of the modifications to the regulation. I think that with regard to the non-availability exemption, that is a welcome change to the regulation. It raises some questions, but certainly welcome change to the regulation. Other people have talked about commercial availability and what would be classified as a required work truck. There was mention of well, if it doesn't have a cup holder, well, we don't consider that necessarily a reasonable job place requirement.
Right.
My members, we've talked about this, and my members are willing, as a matter of fact, one of them, Stephen Poncelay, who already spoke, are willing to provide prior bid specs to demonstrate what we need. In other words, things that we bought years ago and what our bid specs were before anybody ever envisioned this rule, to demonstrate exactly what we need, because that's what they would be asking for again. So it's not a question of manipulating your bid spec so that you know you wouldn't be able to get an EV or a ZEV, other type of a ZEV alternative. We can demonstrate what we've actually asked to buy in the past, what we've bought in the past, so that there's no lack of trust issue there.
Sure.
And I think that that really needs to be incorporated, because right now we need a definition of commercial availability, and that plays into this non-available exemption process. In terms of the comment about which trucks would be considered part of this and not having the pickup, we know that the pickups are available. Really, are they? I mean, the commercials that we see on television are really pretty and everything, and they're, you know, they're real cute and all, but I've got a member who wanted to buy 100, they got one. And it's not that they said, well, the other 99 are coming. They don't know. The manufacturer won't even let them know. They said, we can only get you one. They wanted to buy 100. They got the funding for it. They want to cut a check, get 100 of them. The manufacturer, all I can send you is one. So I'm not so sure. Available in concept, perhaps. Available in practice, absolutely not. And I think that reality needs to be incorporated into this regulation. I wanted to talk about a couple of other things very quickly. You brought, earlier in the slide deck, talked about the one-time reporting rule. I haven't been able to get back with staff on this. Very happy that you released some public version of the data that you collected, but to be very candid, it wasn't that helpful to my members in terms of understanding where there might be demand for expansion of the distribution systems. It's just too aggregated. And I would encourage CARB to work, I would like to work with CARB to identify a way we could get more disaggregated, more granular data for my members so that they can understand where the vehicles that will need charging are going to be, where they need to be charged, things of that nature, so that we can meet those infrastructure needs as quickly as possible. I'm going to skip a few of my other points because other people have already talked about them, and I can go back to them later in today's workshop. But I also wanted to re-raise the question of cost. And I understand your response that cost isn't a primary driver, but I encourage CARB to consider this within the framework of what the state is trying to do in whole in terms of electrifying not just transportation, but electrifying buildings. As a recent LAO report showed, the more expensive electricity becomes, the more difficult it becomes to get consumers to electrify. And while this is one part of the cost structure that publicly owned electric utilities face in providing service, I can paraphrase the late Everett Dirksen, said, $1 million here, $1 million there, pretty soon you're talking about real money. And at some point, we need to have a conversation about all of these cost drivers that are raising the cost of this critical service that can be brought to bear to address the state's greenhouse gas and other environmental goals. So in wrapping this up, would like to work with you to get more granular data for the one-time reporting regulation. would like to see a very clear discussion about what it means to be commercially available, and be happy to present to CARB previous actual bid specs that our members use to buy the vehicle, so CARB can be confident that what we're asking for is what we have always asked for and what we've always purchased. That way there's a very clear understanding. There's no trust issues there at all. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the event today.
Okay, I do want to touch on a couple of items. Because we've heard it more than once at this point, the definition of commercially available. So if people have comments on what that definition should look like, and what the issue you want us to make sure is addressed in how we identify what's available, by all means, we'd appreciate any feedback there. I want to make sure we're not spinning the nuance differently. I mean, what we're trying to do is find a straightforward approach in terms of finding a good balance between simplifying what's available, what's not available. Yeah, like as I mentioned, yeah, not creating inadvertent loopholes or unintended consequences. So it's not so much of specifically a trust issue. It's partly let's make sure that we hit the nail on the head, if you will, and kind of hit the main issues. And so the flexibility, hopefully, that you do have would give you some options as well. The thing at least we haven't really discussed is I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. In this particular proposal, we are not requiring anybody to retire any trucks whatsoever. I mean, if your existing fleet, you're going to keep your trucks for another particular truck another 10 years, there's nothing here that says you have to get rid of it anytime soon. It's ultimately when you're making those purchases to then go to zero emission. In terms of the data, yes, we collect the data from fleets on the operational characteristics. We're actually working with the CEC to make it available for planning purposes. But at the same time, we did not ask a lot of the questions that I think the utility needs to know. And so I want to make sure that this is not, we did not ask future forecasting questions of how you would electrify your fleet, what locations you would electrify first, whether you're relying on public infrastructure or retail infrastructure, or whether you would potentially install your own, and even if you would, where would you do it? So there's none of those kinds of things in the question we asked. It was, how does your fleet operated? How many miles you do on a daily basis, and some other questions to that effect, and even how long you keep your trucks and questions of that nature. So
now on that point, I go back to what the representative from the LA port mentioned. And we don't need necessarily I think my planners would love to have as much information as they can have, of course, but we have to build out the distribution system so that even if we're not the ones that are installing the charging equipment, that the pipe, if you will, gets to their meter so that they can then on their end of the meter build their charging and get the power to the charging equipment. I think you did ask about how many trucks they have and how many miles, and that would be useful information, because if they're going to be electrifying those trucks, then that helps us to better understand what their energy needs are going to be. And so that information, I respect the fact that, and my members responded to this of course, as regulated entities, and I respect the fact that you want to honor that confidentiality. And so I'm hoping we can find a way to get a little bit more granular data. I'm very happy to hear that you're working with the CEC to provide that, because the CEC is a critical partner in this planning process.
Right, and then yes, and so I don't know, maybe if you should be the contact, I want to get you in contact with some of the truck stop operators and so on, because we know we're going to need and want retail infrastructure along the key corridors as well. That's not necessarily this group, but there's a number of places, and as you may be aware, I mean, we're looking to electrify the ports the fastest, and there's some key corridors that also need to be supported for that to happen too. So there's some things that I think we can be working on, and make sure everybody's up to speed. I mean, we're closely working with CEC, the PUC, GoBiz, Governor's Office, on how to strategically roll out infrastructure so that it is available to meet these timelines and goals, not just in the truck sector, but off-road equipment and other infrastructure, including streamlining permitting processes and things of that nature. So all of those things need to happen to get to our goals and to get this done as smoothly and as quickly as feasible. Oh, and then, okay, one last point I'll just make. We didn't show it here, but we acknowledge clearly that if you're putting in infrastructure, there's obviously a cost associated with that. And if you're buying the vehicle, that generally they're going to be a higher upfront cost, especially in the early years here. And over time, we expect those differences to become smaller. But there's also huge fuel savings. And so we do believe that in most applications that if you're talking battery electric vehicle, that because of LCFS, your electricity cost could be effectively zero. And I don't think that should be ignored. And I know that the way you deal with your budget process and capital costs versus ongoing costs is different. But at the end of the day, these can be neutral or ultimately lower cost operation over time. So I want to make sure that it's also not misunderstood that just because there's a higher upfront cost doesn't mean that the cost of service or the long-term cost of operating the vehicle isn't going to necessarily be, and that means that it will be potentially neutral or better as well. So I want to make sure that's not lost in our discussion.
Yeah,
so
I appreciate that. That is certainly consistent with what we see in cost patterns for other technology evolution. The timeline for that is unclear. And so at this point, and particularly certainly early on, I'm not even sure how this, without some sort of a cost restriction, how this rule could be written. But in any event, I do recognize that, respect that, and it's a question of timing on that as well.
Yes. Okay, so Molly, we'll take one more and then we'll go to the remaining slides and then continue this discussion. So if you have your hand up, keep your hand up, and we'll just continue after the next few slides, after the next speaker.
All right, I have Eva Pleasure. Eva, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So first I want to say thank you to Tony and the whole CARB team. Really appreciate your efforts in with the updated regulations. Thank you for taking our input. And I know that the implementation of this rule will be all in the details as we move forward. I second a lot of the comments that my predecessors made. So I'm going to stick to three main comments that I want to make. The implementation date is a tremendous concern to me. And I'm with, oh, by the way, I'm with San Diego County Water Authority just for that. Because for two reasons. I had a meeting yesterday with San Diego Gas and Electric provider, and they gave us, just to go through their process to put in electrification infrastructure for fleets, we're looking at 18 months. So that would be, if I started today, that would, just to go through their process before construction even begins, it would be just, if you begin the regulation the way it's written, I wouldn't be able to clear their process until that's in place. So that's a concern, because from the get-go, I will not have the infrastructure if I order vehicles. And even if it's 6 months, a year, I will not have the infrastructure to meet that deadline. The second thing is budgets. Like you heard before, budget's a concern. We do a 2-year budget, and we're actually starting our budget process for the 24-25 fiscal years. So if we don't have a regulation that says, hey, you need to buy vehicles, it's hard for me to budget for something that is not a regulation yet. So having a regulation implementation date that is so close to adoption is very difficult to implement in terms of how we budget for the capital purchases of these regulations. The other thing is, which will affect many smaller utilities, not necessarily us since we serve the county, you have small utilities that serve low-income communities and disadvantaged communities. The cost differential between a currently available truck and electric vehicles, they may not be able to afford it. And I understand that there will be grants and so forth for them, but you also have to understand that their technical expertise are not there either. So there's a lot to consider when you're rolling out a regulation that is so close with its implementation date, that is so close to adoption date. I see substantial issues there. As far as commercial availability, I will second many of the speakers. I'm actually attending next week an expo of the Advanced Clean Transportation Expo, that they will be doing a lot of demos of electric vehicles. And I will have very frank conversations with the vendor, because my experience has been when we've bid, the functionality of what we need is currently not available. And I would really encourage also to add to the exemptions, not just a list, but if we provide a good scope, a good bid template, bid spec, and we do not get any bids from an electric vehicle, that be taken into consideration, even though somebody from, one of the fleets says that how it's available. If Peterbilt says, hey, we have it, but you can't, they won't bid it. It's not like I can go and say, hey, please bid for me so I can get your vehicle. That's a concern because I have gone out and looked, and I couldn't get bids for what the functionality that we needed. And big part of the functionality is what some of the speakers talked about is the duty cycles and being able to remotely charge. We have vehicles that very seldom come back to the yard because the employees are deployed from home, especially when we have aqueduct shutdowns. So you will have a vehicle that will not see the yard for 10 days or more. How do we charge that vehicle if it's continuously deployed? So that's a big thing to consider. So I would really encourage you to really think through those, the cost, the commercial availability, and implementation date, and also the details of the implementation. Because if the implementation, especially on the exemption, is not smooth and quick, there will be a lot of problems in terms of costs. I had an incident dealing with one of the AQMD districts where between the time we submitted our paperwork to the time it was processed, that vehicle was no longer available. And by the way, it went over $100,000 more in price. So now we have to restart the process, and it just becomes unattainable. So I really appreciate you listening to me, Tony. Thank you so much for allowing me to comment, and I look forward to future developments.
Thank you for your comments, and yeah, a number of us will actually be at the expo, so we'll be alongside you there to maybe talk to some of those manufacturers. Okay, so we'll go ahead and transition to just the remaining slides we have, and then we'll open the discussion again to the next commenter.
All right, I will take it away then. Thank you, Tony. So next we're going to cover emissions outreach and next steps. Okay, so again, first we'll talk about emissions, then we'll talk about the outreach we've conducted for the ACF regulation. We'll talk about infrastructure and funding and some resources for fleets and our next steps. Okay, the ACF emission inventory was developed using the latest available MFAC model, which was released to the public last Friday. Most of the methodology and assumptions used in the inventory modeling stayed consistent to those that were presented in the inventory work group meeting that happened last November, with recent updates to the regulatory language reflected in the following slides. The results shared here are all compared to what we refer to as the legal business as usual baseline, which considers recently adopted regulations such as the Advanced Clean Trucks and Heavy Duty Omnibus regulations. One thing to note is that the current inventory does not include the impact of the heavy duty inspection and maintenance regulation, as it is still pending approval from the Office of Administrative Law. These next couple of slides depict total emission reductions from the regulation as a whole, and not just the public fleet component alone. So by 2050, the total NOx emissions benefits in California resulting from ACF is expected to be around 97 tons per day. Okay, we have also computed the projected emissions for fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5 emissions. Here we included both exhaust emissions and brake wear emissions. With the current proposed regulation, ACF will lead to approximately 0.3 tons per day PM 2.5 emission reductions in 2031 and 1 ton per day in 2037. In addition to criteria pollutants, we have also modeled the greenhouse gas emissions under the ACF proposal. So please note that the data presented here only includes tank to wheel or tailpipe CO2 emissions. With the current regulation proposal, ACF is projected to result in around 20 million metric tons per year CO2 reductions by 2045. Okay, over the next couple of slides, we will show the projected technology distribution under the proposed ACF regulation. So this projection not only includes the 3 different sectors or regulated groups in ACF, but it also considers the 100% ZEV sales requirement that will start with model year 2040 for trucks that are first sold in California. So unlike heavier trucks that may be purchased out of state, almost all Class 2B through 3 vehicles will be first sold in California or are California certified. So the impact of the manufacturer's sales requirement is significant. With the 100% sales requirement by 2040, we would see ACF bring more zero emission Class 2B through 3 pickup trucks and vans than ACT, resulting in almost 600,000 Class 2B through 3 ZEVs by 2045, which is more than 30% increase compared to what we originally included in ACT. For Class 4 through 8 vocational trucks and buses, with both the sales and the purchase requirement, the current ACF proposal will bring almost 200,000 ZEVs by 2035. And this number goes up to 360,000 by 2045, resulting in 85,000 more than ACT would bring alone. The difference between ACT and ACF ZEV projection becomes more significant for the Class 7 through 8 tractors. Based on vehicle registration and survey data that we use for MFAC development, many tractors were actually purchased out of state or with non-California certified engines. This is to say a large portion of the tractor population will not be regulated under ACT manufacturer requirements. However, since all fleet owners that are subject to ACF fleet requirements need to comply with the proposed ZEV transition pathways, including out-of-state vehicles that originally were not covered in ACT, we are seeing much more ZEVs in this group, resulting in approximately 270,000 zero-emission tractors by 2045. So overall, combining all weight classes together, ACF as a whole is consistently bringing more ZEVs as compared to ACT, with more than 1.2 million ZEVs by 2045, a 60% increase as compared to the 780,000 brought by ACT. Okay, so to achieve our numerous climate change, air quality, zero emission vehicle development, and petroleum reduction goals, the state has adopted an aggressive multi-pronged strategy that uses incentives to complement regulatory approaches. So to date, CARB has administered over $8 billion in funding to support clean transportation, and CARB strives to maintain a balanced portfolio of available investments. Each of these programs have their own distinct goals that support the state's broader strategy. And not every program can fund every worthy technology. Maintaining the integrity of the program goals is essential to ensure that the state achieves both immediate air quality benefits and that it supports the innovative technologies necessary to meet the state's vision of a zero emission economy. And outside of CARB, other federal, state, and local agencies have complementary funding sources as well. These investments have played a critical role to help advance technologies and bring us where we are today. So this year, the administration has doubled down by proposing an additional $6.1 billion for equitable zero emission vehicle transportation over the next 5 years. to the California Air Resources Board, to the Energy Commission, the California State Transportation Agency, and the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. These investments build on the $3.9 billion ZEV acceleration package approved as part of the 2021 budget, bringing the state's total investment over a 6-year period to $10 billion. Okay, so beginning back in February 2020, CARB staff began informing the public of the proposed ACF regulation and development process. Over the past 2 years of the rule development, staff has hosted over 17 public work groups, workshops, and forums, and conducted over 273 group and individual meetings with over 130 stakeholders. We have sent over 273,000 mailers to vehicle owners and sent numerous emails through our listservs and the truckers reporting database system. Staff has also hosted broadly focused listening sessions for input on trucks and drayage activities, and met with several groups of clean air advocates to ensure communities impacted most heavily by medium and heavy duty trucks were included in this planning effort. Staff also offered outreach materials, training courses, and attempted to spread the word through social media, interviews, and in-person events. And throughout all of this engagement and outreach, we have heard consistently the need for infrastructure planning and resources for fleets in their transition to zero emission. So CARB hears you and is working closely with other state agencies, especially the Governor's Office of Economic and Business Development, the California Energy Commission, and the California Public Utilities Commission, to provide the framework for heavy-duty zero-emission vehicle funding. And 2 key aspects of this framework are planning and funding. In addition, CARB continues to discuss the issues surrounding infrastructure with stakeholders and electrical providers. Many of you may have tuned in for our recent work groups on infrastructure, but if not, you can watch recordings on these meetings on the ACF Meetings and Events webpage. Okay, so CARB staff is also working hard on making resources available for fleets who will be transitioning to zero emission technologies. There are several websites available now with information on planning, total cost of ownership calculators, and funding, with more to be added soon. And staff is also working on creating training opportunities with a focus on zero emission technologies and regulation implementation. We are also looking for innovative ways to encourage and support other fleets who are not affected by this rule, so that they too will transition to zero emission technologies. And we are looking for ideas that go above and beyond CARB's regulations, policies, and investments. So please stay tuned for upcoming listening sessions or focus groups that will dive into these ideas. Okay, so this slide gives the URLs for CARB's informal comment docket. So you can find that, and you can find resources used to support this workshop and recordings from past workshops on CARB's website. You can also contact us through our program email address or by the phone number listed on the slide. So the notice for this for the 45-day rulemaking package is expected to go out in early September of this year and will be presented to the board in October. Okay, so that concludes our presentation. Thanks for attending the workshop today, and we will move back to questions and discussion. Molly,
Okay.
I think you're muted if you're talking.
I guess in the meantime, I'm Allison Torres. Okay, you should be able to speak. Go Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, hi, this is Allison Torres with Eastern Municipal Water District. Thank you for the presentation and for the opportunity to comment today. EMWD is a provider of essential public services. We're a water, wastewater, and recycled water agency in Southwest Riverside County down in Southern California. We have a 555 square mile service area, and we serve approximately 826,000 people. We operate 4 wastewater treatment plants. And I have some specific questions. Some of those have been kind of answered by the previous commenters, so I won't rehash those. But just on the ZEV unavailability exemption, I just want to echo the concern with excluding pickups and tractors from that process. I understand the need to streamline, and I appreciate that. But if the vehicles are not available in the configurations that we need for our services, I think it's important to make sure that we have a avenue to seek those exemptions. I appreciate the list, and I want to echo the comment to define commercial availability and to consider the number of manufacturers available and the duty cycles in those definitions. So we will provide some written comments related to that. Just some specifics on the list development. Does that process enable non-manufacturer feedback from our agencies, like such as was referred before with regard to specific specifications?
So this is Tony here. The idea is to identify, here's the criteria that would be used, and if the criteria are met, then it would be put on the list. And so the way we're trying to address it is what the primary purpose or the intended function of the vehicle is, as kind of that mechanism, and to leave it at that as the primary criteria. So it's not specific to a duty cycle or a particular application. It's ultimately whether the vehicle exists in the configuration you need. So ultimately, so that's the way we approached it. So it's ultimately what those criteria are that would establish it, and who makes the demonstration or provides the information doesn't matter. It could be a fleet owner. It could be, frankly, it could be the manufacturer themselves, or a group representative says, hey, I got a lot of members that have this kind of vehicle. Here's the information that shows that I can't get a ZEV at this point, and we would list it if those criteria are met.
Okay, thank you for that. And how often do you anticipate that list kind of being updated?
We did not put any specific boundaries on a time limit. So in principle, it would be somewhat continuous. I mean, as information became available, then we would use that to identify it. I mean, so to a degree, we would expect, sure, at the beginning, we'd spend a little bit more time on adding things to the list and getting the information on it. But then over time, if over time, if it's like, hey, here's another vehicle that wasn't listed before, but now somebody's bringing it to our attention, we would evaluate it at the time we got the information.
Okay, and I don't know at this point, do you have any kind of estimates of how long it might take to add a vehicle to the list once you receive that information showing that it should be eligible to add?
I can't give you a straight answer on that. I think it depends on the situation. I mean, if the criteria are clearly met without question, then it'd just be a matter of a few days to take care of it. But if there's ambiguity, and then in some cases, I mean, I foresee that we would reach out to some of the manufacturers as well to get some confirmation. And so if it's kind of not as clear as we would like, I think it might take a little longer. But I can't imagine that we're talking, roughly. Well, to me, it's just a matter of clarifying the facts, I guess. And so there could be some back and forth, but again, that's where we're trying to find that right balance of saying, hey, if it's a service body truck, I don't really care about the details about the service body. You need a way to transport your tools. Manufacturer A, B, and C don't have it, but D and E do. So there's really no reason to not purchase that. It's kind of where we're trying to keep it so it can be somewhat streamlined.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. It just you know, with the budgeting and purchasing, time is of the essence. And so it's ideal for it to not be a lengthy process to get something added. And so when do you anticipate having kind of an initial list available? Do you expect it to be in advance of the 2024 effective date?
Yeah, I could, well, yes, I anticipate that if, again, the board, just to make sure, sorry, I'm gonna go backwards a little bit. So as we mentioned, we're gonna take a recommendation to our board in October. This is gonna be a 2-hearing process. So that'll be just the first hearing. We'll have to come back for a second hearing for their final decision. And that could be a few months later, or even up to 5 or 6 months later. So once the board makes a final decision as to what the rule looks like, and ultimately if these provisions change, at that point, we would look to putting that list together and having it available before 2024. And then if we need to add more vehicles into 2024, we would continue to evaluate them.
Okay, I appreciate that. And then with regard to the backup vehicle language, have you considered adding kind of a multi-year rolling average to the mileage? I mean, if a vehicle is designated as a backup and it goes over by 5 miles, it seems impractical to immediately retire that vehicle from your fleet.
Right. Yeah, this is one of those, I don't know, a little bit of a challenging. Yeah, I understand that, but at the same time, one of the things is, hey, when the speed limit is 55 and you're over 55, then you know you're over the speed limit. If we kind of do a rolling average, we've done that in the past in other rules. It becomes a little messier, if you will, if you have to wait 2 or 3 years to figure out if you're over the average, not over the average, and so on. So I think we'll just take that comment under consideration and look at how we address it. For the most part, under the public fleet portion, I mean, again, we're not saying retire any vehicles. So if you have your vehicles, you're not planning to replace them for 5 years, you're technically not affected. And you wouldn't need to identify vehicles as backup. This is more of a provision here. It's, hey, I have some pretty low use trucks. One got damaged at some expense. I just want to replace it with another because I need it periodically or for, you know, infrequent activities. Then this still gives you an opportunity to go buy something used and keep it in your fleet.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Just to kind of echo some previous comments on the declared emergencies, you know, as essential services, we do respond to emergencies that are not always declared, but are equally important for public health and safety. So I just urge that to be kind of considered in kind of the longevity of, or the resilience of our fleets over time. I also want to echo the comments about the public funds. It's a little unclear in the language as far as what would be counted differently. And being that ZEVs are going to be a significant impact financially to public agencies, and you know, we're funded by our ratepayers, we want to make sure that we're not excluded from different funding opportunities that are open for ZEV purchases. And I also have some kind of, I guess, feedback on the definitions of compliance year and compliance date and calendar year, and kind of how that's kind of interpreted in the language. So I just would encourage some clarification there, maybe adding for the previous starting year, I'm sorry, the previous year starting in January 1st, 2025, since your compliance is basically for your previous year of purchase. And just to kind of, I guess, get some clarification on the purchasing when you're adding, you mentioned before that that's based on, for example, your notice to proceed date, or maybe the date that your purchase order was issued. So for the 2027 year, when 100% of ZEV purchases, 100% of purchases have to be ZEVs, any notice or purchase order dated after that date would apply to your 2027 compliance year. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Even if the delivery happens after like January 1st, 2028.
Sure, yeah. I mean, at this point, we anticipate that the vehicle delivery could easily be a year, 2 years, and frankly, for more unique vehicles, even up to 3 years.
So when you're doing the administrative reporting for that, I believe you have in here that date of purchase and date of delivery are both required information. But when you're doing your reporting, for example, on January 1st, 2028 for the 2027 year, it's going to be, you're only going to possibly have the purchase date in there. Is that understood, I guess?
Well, okay, so the way I make sure I got it right, but somebody cover me if I didn't. The way we have it is you would report the vehicles that are in your possession. You wouldn't necessarily be reporting that you ordered some the year before unless we were to ask for audit reasons. You'd keep that documentation. You'd ultimately report the vehicle when you receive it, and then you report the date that you actually ordered it as part of that. So
so if I purchased 2 CNG vehicles and 2 ZEV, and I received, all of those purchases were made in the 2027 year, and I'm reporting them first quarter 2028, you're saying I wouldn't actually report those in 2028 because I haven't received the vehicles?
yeah, my presumption is at that point you don't necessarily have a VIN to report. So you might know the type of vehicle you're purchasing, but we wouldn't necessarily have you report the vehicle details. It would be records that you would keep. But you know, we're open to suggestion on modifying that. If you want to put if it makes more sense to say, no, I want to report that I've ordered something with that, but I don't know the VIN yet, and I'll update it later. I mean, we're open to that too.
Yeah, I'm
just a little bit of a lag issue, but
yeah, I'm just trying to understand the logistics, I guess, more specifically for the 2024 to 2026 purchase years where you've got that whole 50%, because let's say I got one of the, maybe the CNG vehicle happened to come, I'm not saying that this would happen, but in 6 months, but my ZEVs are ordered, but not necessarily received, then I would only be reporting that I purchased 2 CNGs, and that wouldn't necessarily show the 50% compliance. So I'm just trying to understand the logistics of the reporting and the dates.
So that is the approach we're taking. So in that case, we may ask you a question or two, or we might leave it to, okay, we'll wait to see when those other ones come in. And the idea here is that you would report them within 30 days of receiving them as well. So this is kind of a rolling average, but we would ultimately look at, once you receive the vehicles, the dates originally ordered, and it's like, hey, 2 years ago, looks like they ordered those CNGs, they didn't order ZEVs, then our enforcement team might be talking to you at that point. But we wouldn't do it the first year per se, just because we know there's a lag time.
Okay, so then it wouldn't necessarily impact that compliance certificate. Like if you had reported the CNGs and they were delivered, but you hadn't yet received your ZEVs, but you're saying you wouldn't actually report those, and even though you placed the order for them, but you haven't received them, so you wouldn't actually report them until you receive them.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, I guess if there's any suggestions on a better way to handle it, because yeah, we wouldn't be able to instantly know if in that example, whether the fleet met the requirement or not until roughly, potentially a year later or 6 months later or something like that.
Okay, I'll try to work through that a little bit more. Yeah, I'm just trying to kind of figure out how the dates align.
What we were trying to do, yeah, so we anticipate there would be some lag there, but the idea though was that we don't believe that we think it would be too challenging to report phantom vehicles because you've ordered a number, but you just don't know enough about the specific one because it's still a year out. You wouldn't have that information, so we didn't want to put a requirement to report information you couldn't have. And so maybe it's as simple as maybe we would need to go a little further and say, hey, just tell me how many you've ordered and of each type as just an input field, how many ZEVs versus total orders for that calendar year. And then we can cross-check that later with the details that you report.
Right. Yeah, it's just at the same time, we're trying to, with the length that some of these things take in the procurement, we also want to make sure that we're in compliance, and we don't want to find out after the fact that it's interpreted differently. So yeah, I'll kind of.
And that's critical. And again, this is where the language matters a lot. It's like, yeah, we want to make sure that we write this the right way so that there is little to no question and no misinterpretation issues. I mean, that's the whole point of getting the details out here. It's like, let's get this down so that everybody that reads it interprets it the same way, so there is no confusion.
Okay, yeah, that's a good plan. Just to kind of add to that, in terms of order cancellations, I saw some language in there regarding cancellations of order if the fleet owner, but I just want to get some feedback on what's the impact on our fleet's compliance in a situation where an order that we place is canceled by the vehicle manufacturer, the builder. You know, in the climate that we're in with some of the supply chain issues,
Right.
this is kind of critical.
Yeah, I don't know that we have any language to address that. Does the manufacturer delay piece or the vehicle delivery delay issue isn't even being raised here because we weren't expecting that?
Yeah, we have language about the order cancellations if the fleet owner cancels, but nothing on the manufacturer side. We don't have the vehicle delivery delay as it isn't applicable to this portion of the regulation. Yeah. So that's going to be something we consider definitely.
Yeah, we'll note it. I guess we'll just note it as how does that get addressed and what should we put language in there for that?
Okay, well, thank you for that. I appreciate you allowing me to go through some of the questions. We'll add some additional written questions, but just at the high level, I just want to step back for a minute just in terms of the high level concern for the wastewater sector. I know it's kind of been mentioned previously by some others, but I just want to reiterate that no single use can utilize all the biogas. And so there really is a need to make sure we have multiple pathways for the use of biogas in the transportation sectors as well as others. And so I'd really encourage staff to preserve that pathway in this regulation in some way, whether that's including RNG vehicles as NZEVs or some other options. So I'd appreciate being involved in those meetings as well that you set up with others. And, you know, as a member of CASA and SCAP, as well as Aqua, you know, I'd just like to echo EMWD's support of some of the comments made by those agencies as well. So thank you very much.
Next in line to speak is Tom Swenson. Tom, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
Yeah, thanks for that. Hey, Tony, I wanted to come back to a comment you made around omnibus and the roll-in schedule. And what I think I heard you say was that the 0.02 NOx standard becomes effective in 2024, but it doesn't until 2027. So it's two steps. So
I understand that, but no, so what I said was the in-use emissions in 24 are going to be pretty much the same for both fuel types, because we're getting into nuance here. The standard is 0.05, warranty and other testing requirements are substantially different that make that 0.05 a real-world emissions lower, because even though the optional standard right now is 0.02, it doesn't have certain load cycle tests and doesn't have certain warranty requirements. So there's no reason to believe at this point that the engines certified before are going to be any cleaner than what's going to be required starting in 2024. And then in 2027, yeah, the standard also goes down, but all of the warranty and test cycle changes that were done would also be in effect. So that it'll be even cleaner then.
I think I agree with what you just said. However, I don't think it's appropriate to characterize it quite like the way you're characterizing it. I mean, yes, things are getting very clean and very, you know, the differences are getting tighter and tighter. And omnibus absolutely has more duty cycle, different tests, and higher warranties and all of that. And I mean, I'm sorry, I should have, it's Tom Swenson with Cummins. Sorry about that. You know, we're going to certify the natural gas line under omnibus as well. So it will carry, you know, all of those same requirements. I don't want somebody to, as you say, the details are important, right? And so to say, well, it's all basically the same is, I think that mischaracterizes the situation.
Okay. All right. I mean, yeah, at the end, okay, I'm not sure how to better characterize it, but yeah, there's not going to be much of a difference. And again,
Well, I mean, if you want to go, I mean, if you really wanted to go down that path, then, you know, zero tailpipe, there's not much of a difference.
Okay. Again, we're talking about the life of the vehicle, not just when it's first certified.
I get it. Details are important.
Yeah.
Okay, next in line to speak is Todd Campbell. Todd, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
Thank you, Molly. Hi, Tony and CARB staff. Thank you for having this workshop, and you get Tom Swenson and Todd Campbell back to back. Todd Campbell with Clean Energy. I want to kind of build on what Tom was saying. I assume at the beginning of this rule, you're going to have more exemptions, in terms of ZEV availability than not. And obviously, as this rule gets more and more refined and you're implementing it, those exemptions will decrease over time. And I presume, between 2024 and 2027, that's going to be a critical period where we do have an opportunity to prevent the purchase of dirtier internal combustion engines and promote cleaner ones. And I think what Tom is trying to convey to you, Tony, and what I kind of get a little bit confused about is everyone that produces an engine in 2024 has to meet the omnibus in use standard. So it's confusing to me when you say, when the industry is expressing its intent to do a 0.02 gram compliant omnibus engine, that somehow the in-use testing of, which, by the way, that study isn't finalized, so it's kind of, we still need to QA/QC that. But I assume, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think all internal combustion engines have in-use emissions issues. That's why we do in-use testing. But at the same time, we're saying we're going to certify not at the 0.05 gram standard. We're looking to certify at the 0.02 gram standard. And that's the 2024 standard under the omnibus. It's 0.05. But we're talking about meeting the 2027 standard early. Does that make sense to you?
Pardon?
Does that make sense to you? I mean, that's where I'm getting confused here, because you're saying, I'm not talking about the engine that we're selling today. I'm talking about the engine we're planning to sell in 2024.
Yeah, no. If that's what Tom is referring to, then we're talking slightly different things. Yeah, at this point, I mean, I'm not aware that anybody's actually certified the omnibus standard, because it's just a new standard.
We intend to. I mean, that's when we.
Okay, no. That's great. No, that's great. And again, yeah, for I don't know, people who are interested, yes, the standard in omnibus is 0.05, but because of the other changes, we think that that's going to be essentially 90% cleaner than a 2010 engine. And then in 27, it goes down even more. And so if you're saying that Cummins or others may certify to the 27 standard early, then sure, that would be cleaner than what would be certified in 24. But I was referring to engines required to meet the 24, or the ones that are going to be meeting the standard are essentially the same. You're referring to potentially certifying 3 years early.
Yeah, and I totally get, your point by saying, look, under the omnibus rule, 2024 engines are going to be 2024 engines. But, in our offline conversations with you and staff, we've been floating the concept that if we deliver you a 2027 compliant engine in 2024, wouldn't that be ideal to work into the this rulemaking, especially if, I expect you to get a lot of exemptions. I mean, that's my personal assumption. I mean, the problem with these rules are we assume a lot of things, right? We assume availability, we assume cost, we assume implementation of infrastructure, the readiness of a number of things. And I know you guys are working very hard to get it right, but I also know that that's a pretty tall task. I mean, you guys are doing very challenging work, and that's what CARB is intended to do. But I also recognize that even if I tried to do this role, it would be a very daunting task for me. And it's not a comment on staff or anybody. It's just a daunting task to do. And congratulations.
And again, we're trying to coordinate it, but we're relying on a lot of this feedback to help us get it.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, I think it would be to your CARB's advantage to have some sort of allowance, as many of the stakeholders had mentioned on this workshop, to have a RNG, or not even, it doesn't have to be an RNG, a 0.02 gram option as an NZEV until 2027, assuming somebody is able to actually produce it. And there is an application where ZEVs can't deliver on that. That's not only in the interest of public health, I think it's also in the interest of supporting CARB's 2027 omnibus standard, that it's actually possible to do a 0.02 gram engine. And furthermore, it would help us with our out-of-state fleets, because we are debating right now a 0.02, whether we will put in a 0.02 gram standard at the national level. As you know, those trucks that come in from out of state, we have a very difficult time trying to manage. So I think that that's where, when you make the statement that the South Coast would agree with you, that there would be no difference, I would say their indirect source rules and their desire to pursue up to $600 million this year in the budget for near zero natural gas trucks says otherwise. They do think there is a significant difference, and there will be continuing to be a difference, because we are indicating to you, or signaling to you and to the South Coast, that we do plan to meet the more strenuous standards and meet the 2027 standard early.
Got it.
The final thing I would say is, I strongly support the stakeholders, David Rothbart and others mentioned this, on also pursuing, not just in terms of electrification, but also hydrogen pathways, and how we can use renewable natural gas as a net negative carbon fuel in the hydrogen sector. And we need, as a fuel supplier and renewable natural gas producer, we want to work with you, and we want to think through how we can make successful investments to transition from an internal combustion to a zero emission platform future. And so, I strongly encourage and applaud you for being willing to meet with many of the stakeholders on this call to discuss how that actually happens, and avoid sunken investments. And certainly, clean energy as a fuel provider and a producer would love to be, to the extent it's feasible, a part of those conversations as well, because we have a huge footprint in California, where we are at this moment looking at where can we make the key investments, critical investments in the hydrogen infrastructure that could harness renewable natural gas and support hydrogen adoption up and down the state. So I wanted to share that with you, and thank you for that, and encourage you to pursue that effort.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next in line to speak is Kevin Brown. Kevin, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
Hi, I'm Kevin Brown with the Manufacturers Emission Controls Association. I got a couple of questions for clarification pertaining to slide 24, where it mentions the new zero emissions chassis conversion. I couldn't find a definition of that in the draft regulation. So I wondered what that might be and who might approve those, and what assurance measures might be required under that category.
That is in essence just trying to make it as clear as we could that when we're talking about new vehicles, you can buy a vehicle that's ground up, built from the manufacturer as a ZEV. But there's also a lot of companies out there that will take an existing vehicle like a gasoline vehicle, pull the engine, replace it all before it ever goes to the initial purchaser. So that's also a new vehicle sale, but that we refer to that as a conversion in essence because the vehicle was first built as a different fuel, for example. But we're treating those as equivalent.
Yeah, who approves those conversions?
Paul, can you help me here? I mean, ultimately, as far as vehicles, well, actually, it doesn't apply there.
Well, I think in some cases, they do still need to receive an executive order from CARB to convert the vehicle. So that would be
it's CARB approved conversion. That's right.
Yeah, and so there isn't necessarily a certification process for electrification other than providing information about the drivetrain. For instance, with the sales requirement on the ACT regulation starting 2024, manufacturers will have to certify to the ZEP certification requirement, where that applies to engine certified vehicles. But chassis certified vehicles in the 2B to 3 range don't have a separate standard at this point, and that's something we're actually discussing internally. It's like, how to put some assurance measures in place for that particular category.
So Tony, if I just follow up with an email to you, could you direct me to where I could find information on the approval of ZE chassis conversions, just because I'm sure some of our members will ask about it.
Okay, yeah, please send us an email. We'll follow up.
Thank you.
Next in line to speak is David Rentschler. David, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tony and staff, for putting this together and giving us an opportunity to comment. I'm the Fleet Division Manager for the City of Fairfield. I'm also the Chairman of the Municipal Equipment Maintenance Association for Northern California, representing over 50 government fleets here in Northern California. So I have a few items I wanted to speak on. I know that some of these we've been working on for a long time, but the first is accidents. Most of the time, insurance recovery is not enough to replace specialty vehicles, especially in the medium and heavy duty sector. And a lot of times budgets won't have enough money to cover the increased battery electric vehicle or hydrogen electric vehicle replacement cost if there's one available. So this question has been asked several times, although I haven't seen anything in the draft regulation that provides a solution or that addresses that situation. Is that something you can speak to or not?
Well, so I guess, David, the question is, what are you looking for as the solution? In essence, saying, let's just say a 10-year-old truck got in an accident, needs to be replaced. You want language that would, in essence, say, go ahead and buy another diesel to replace it?
Well, so take a 10-wheel dump truck, take a VACCON sewer truck, something that's $200,000 to $300,000. Say it's 5 to 10 years old, it gets, has an accident. Doesn't matter whose fault it is. The insurance covers, $50,000 of a $300,000 vehicle. Well, now the replacement is $600,000. A small city can't afford that.
I see.
So there really should be some type of ability for a government agency to have another vehicle they can buy, whether it's a used one. Maybe you allow them to buy a used one in that situation. We just haven't seen anything regarding some type of ability. The ability to buy a used one would be great. However, there may not be any for sale. People may be holding on to them since they're not required to replace them. Another topic I wanted to bring up real quick is, so we've talked about if vehicles are canceled by the agency, you have to buy another one, right? So you have to buy an electric one. I thought there was language that said if the OEM cancels your order, you still have to buy another BEV. Did I see that language in there?
I don't believe we have any language that addresses the situation if the manufacturer were to cancel the order.
Okay, so that's been happening a lot over the last 12 months. We've had several manufacturers of several different size trucks, from pickups to Class 8s. Another thing that's been happening over the last 12 months is we can't write our specifications and go through the purchasing process of bidding them out and getting a board approval and then putting them on, cutting a PO and putting them on order until the order bank opens, because that's when the chassis specifications come out. And we have to check those to make sure that they're going to meet what we need. What's been happening in the last 12 months is order banks have been unexpectedly closing early, where they're normally might be open for 6 months. They're closing after 30 days because there's too many orders. The other thing that's happened is they've skipped a model year. So we've planned on replacing a vehicle, and with the specifications already, the general specifications already written, and the order bank never opens because the OEM decided to skip a model year because of whatever, they're changing the design, doing other things, right? These things we've never had before. 2 years ago, you would have never heard of that happening, and now it's happening. So there needs to be something to help us out with that. So if we have 10 purchases planned for next year, next fiscal year, and 5 of them are going to be electric or zero emission, and 5 are going to be gas and diesel. One of those 5 electrics, the order bank doesn't open up. We haven't had a chance to budget to try to make a different vehicle, zero emission. There's all kinds of complications and logistics with that. So we really need something to address that. One other thing I wanted to bring up was the last month on the 12th, we talked to a manufacturer for a personnel bucket truck, F550 with a bucket for our traffic division. And we were told if we gave them a PO last month, we could expect delivery in October of 2026. We've never heard of things like that in the past either. So our world as fleet managers is changing to things that we could never even dream would happen. And I think that we need a little time to get this worked out, and maybe a few more of the offline meetings that we've done with folks that represent some of the major fleets in the state. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is, if I'm not mistaken, earlier you said there was going to be 2 meetings needed to approve the ACF by the board.
Yes.
So by the time the OAL approves this, are they going to be able to approve it before your implementation date?
Yes.
Okay.
Just to make it clear, so when we post the initial statement of reasons, or what we call a staff report, that begins the formal rulemaking process. That is early September. We have 1 year from that date to finalize absolutely everything, respond to every comment, question, and issue, and provide it to OAL. And so any 15-day changes or anything else, all of that has to be completed by the September of the following year. Otherwise, then we start over again.
Okay. And the last thing I wanted to touch on, I speak with a lot of fleet managers here in Northern California. And I'm actually surprised at how many say that they're not going to do anything until you pass a regulation. I do feel for those folks because there are cities I've worked for in the past that have that attitude that until it's a regulation, we're not going to do anything. But a CIP project usually takes 48 months from the time you have full funding and you go to the city engineer and say, I need to do this project. So I don't know how we're going to work together to make this successful. I really don't. The time just isn't there to get the infrastructure in. So thank you for the time. I look forward to the opportunity for MEMA and NAFA to speak with CARB staff on a one-on-one basis. Thank you.
Hey, Dave, before you go, the F550 bucket truck that you were referring to, was that a diesel or is that a zero emission or something else?
V10 gas.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Next in line to speak is Mark Roast. Mark, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
And I guess just quickly, we are at about 12 o'clock, so we still do have a number of hands up. It looks like 11, so we are able to go overtime, but I guess everyone just try to keep your comments under 3 minutes so we can keep the conversation going and get through as many people as possible. Thank you.
Right, and with that too, I would say, yeah, if anybody else has anything they want to say, please raise your hand now, because I'd like to kind of freeze the comment list so that we make sure everybody who has an issue or comment they want to make, they can do so. But then we can close the meeting after those. So we'll give you 3 more minutes to raise your hand, but otherwise we'll just go through this list and give everybody an opportunity to comment.
Mark Roast, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mark Roost with Sustainable Energy Inc., which is a battery and solar and...
Hey, Mark. We're having a hard time hearing you. Is there any way you can get closer to your mic or anything like that?
Oh, we can't hear you, Mark.
Okay. Let's go to the next person.
Sorry,
Mark, if there's, how does Mark get help on any technical difficulties?
Philip Kopernik, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Yeah, thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, everybody. So Philip Kopernik, I'm with Peninsula Clean Energy, which is San Mateo County's community choice energy program, but was previously the fleet manager for Alameda County in the East Bay. Just real brief, I wanted to say that in concept, I applaud CARB staff for doing this. I think this is very much needed and support where you're going. To echo David's comments previously, a lot of folks are not moving and we need them to do so. Even if you have local city policies, fleets have found ways to go slow, let's say. I do want to add that we are having a local fleets assistance program in San Mateo County, and Peninsula Clean Energy, we're putting in over $500,000 in technical assistance to help our local government fleets electrify. And that is comprised of things like a vehicle replacement roadmap, a charging needs assessment, and then some actual site designs to plan a project and then help folks skip the design phase so they can go right to bid, because folks at the local level are slowed down by the design bid build process. So I would really encourage CARB to consider what a technical assistance package would look like to help fleet managers who already have 1,000 other things to do in addition to this get moving. The CEC is looking at a local government fleets funding program, and I would say there's more money needed on a technical assistance offering than there is necessarily for chargers and vehicles at this point, because folks need to be able to get ready so they can start moving. So happy to share more information. I'll also put that in my comments to CARB staff. Thank you.
Next in line to speak is Tracy Fidel. Tracy, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. This is Tracy Fidel with the Port of Oakland. So we're a public utility and we also run a seaport and an airport. First off, thank you for the focused workshop. It really helps me to only have to think about one thing at a time. I know we have drayage trucks coming on Friday. And I also appreciate some of the changes you made since the previous round, in particular, allowing a combustion purchase when there's non-availability of ZEV or near ZEV, instead of just not making any purchase. So like a lot of other people on this call, Mr. Northup, Ms. Torres, I'd really like to get some clarification on commercially available. And I think it would be really helpful if that were a defined term in the regulation. So in particular, the port would like to see in that definition that there be multiple manufacturers and multiple vendors to be considered commercially available. So we, if there's only one manufacturer making a certain vehicle, and then, what happens if they're a brand new startup or they're untested, or we get in a situation where the port could be stuck with a fleet of, 5 or 10 different trucks made by 5 or 10 different manufacturers with 5 or 10 different sets of parts. If there's only one vendor and they're not local and there's nowhere to get it serviced. So I think also the ability to get a vehicle serviced within the region is important. So that was my first comment on the definition of commercial availability. And then on vehicle availability, that's slide 24. How do you prove a negative, I guess is my question. So this is related to Ms. Plazier's comment. Proving that there's no ZE or NZEV. So say we put out a solicitation for zero emission or near zero and we get no responsive bids. Would that count? Would that qualify there? That's my question.
Yeah, the way we have the language now doesn't fit that description very well. Actually, the prior language kind of had it more structured that way, where it was kind of bid specific or fleet specific. And so in trying to streamline, we took this slightly different approach where it would apply. The unavailability question would apply to all the public fleets and all of the other commercial fleets that would be affected by the regulation. So in essence, one list for both purposes. So with the changes, that part kind of was somewhat removed. I guess I'm finding it hard to imagine if the manufacturers are selling them, but you don't get bids. Not sure how that would occur or likely to occur. But yeah, any insight you guys can provide on how that might happen. And I can say, as we kind of touched on, there's a zero emission chassis available in pretty much in every weight class category. So at the end of the day, most of this is going to be about either truly unique, customized like vehicles, or for some reason there's a conflict with the body and the chassis installation of some kind. So I think if you're suggesting, hey, if there's multiple manufacturers of, let's just say it's a class 4 through 6 chassis, there's 3 or 4 of them, but then there's 3 or 4 body suppliers and only one is putting their body on the 4 different chassis. Would you say that means there's only one available, or would you look at that and say, well, technically there's 4, just one body to choose from?
I don't know how to answer that. I'm just thinking if we go out to bid and we don't get any responsive bids for zero or near zero, we can't procure it. So.
Right. Well, no, yeah, because right. So this is finding that balance between making this as straightforward as we can. Because then to me, the first question would be, okay, the chances are that there's something in the bid spec requirement that the vehicle might exist, but doesn't meet whatever criteria you're looking for, whether it's a warranty, a performance requirement, or something.
Yeah, or it could be that they're overcommitted or they don't feel like they can make the time frame we need, or I don't know why they wouldn't bid, but
Yeah. Okay. I mean, okay. So we'll take the comment back. We might have to follow up with you on maybe some examples of where maybe that's happened in the past, and see what we can learn from that.
okay. And then I have I think an easy one for you, which is how far back does the early purchase credit go? So the port bought a zero emission passenger van, a 12-seater van in 2019. I guess we procured it in 2018, and we got 2 zero emission work trucks in 2021. So do those count?
They would, and so the basic criteria is that you still have them at the time.
Oh, yeah.
The credit. So if you, for some reason, sell them or they were demos and you don't have them anymore, then you wouldn't be able to claim the credit. But if you still have them in 24, 5, or 6, whatever year, you want to be able to use that, you would be able to count those and buy a combustion vehicle in its place.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next in line to speak is Mark Roast. Mark, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
Thank you. Is this a lot better? I turned up the microphone.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So first of all, I'm working backwards maybe. Tony, it happens because companies have issues with the the manufacturers, OEMs, have issues with their real range, with their hill climbing ability, and especially a global supply chain crisis, and backlogs go out more than 12 months. And so they're simply, they're simply shutting down, saying, okay, we're not going to do that. We're not going to offer that until we have everything in line. Or because maybe their marketing department doesn't want to deal with it. So that's how it happens. Now let's get back to my list of things here. Okay, I now understand as of a few days ago that there are 80,000 trucks affected by the deadline of the end of this year, and 40,000 of those are Class 8. And you have a September 1st contract requirement, and you haven't even, it's like you tie that together with the batteries for the conversions that our ally is working on, is going to use, which are 8,000 cycle batteries. Those batteries aren't going to be available until June of next year. And there are other parts that are not available yet and will be, so the earliest that they possibly see that they can get a prototype truck done is just before the SEMA show in November. So they're saying we can't come see you and show this truck to you before mid-November. So that kind of makes it really, really hard to do a September 1st contract that cannot be changed for the manufacturer delay issue. So you can't go sell a bunch of that stuff sight unseen. So now we're faced with going out, and I've asked them to get something ready to show by June, using substitute batteries, substitute other components, but at least to get some sense of what it's like. Now, the contract, of course, has to be, you need to give us guidance on how to how a contract needs to be structured so that you will consider that it hasn't changed, because we need to build some flexibility in the contract because there is equipment items specifications that are going to change. Okay, that's one piece. The lithium, and that's a lithium-ion battery. Now, here's the other piece. We now see the possibility of getting our batteries, the long-range batteries, 2,000 or so watt-hours per kilogram, done in low volume production within a year or a year and a half or so, maybe the similar time frame. And the lithium ion batteries are up to 230 kilowatts, I think, for a Class 8 truck. those batteries are not going to power it for more than a couple hundred miles, or maybe even more than 150 miles or less. So that means that we can only sell ahead of time in order to get the delay and to get the subsidy. We can only sell to the short range trucks. We can't sell to the medium and long range trucks because there isn't any battery that'll give you medium and long range with a full payload on a Class 8 truck at this time, which means that, and that's a deal-breaking issue. Okay, up to 4 years. Okay, now on utilities. So we're also going to be doing high performance, high efficiency solar. And we're actually looking at 42% as a possibility efficiency, which is twice.
Mark, I'm not sure how this relates to the proposed rule. Can you?
Well, I'm looking at the proposed, I'm assuming that the provision for delay, the extension for manufacturer delay is part of the proposed rule. Am I mistaken?
It's not part of this public fleet one. It's strictly a purchase requirement. So if they make purchases in 24, and it takes 2 years to get the truck, it takes 2 years to get the truck. It's just based on their purchases.
But okay, well, did you just say 2024? Because I'm looking at the 2020 at the January. I'm looking at the thing where drayage trucks can't go into ports and multimodal rail hubs.
Yeah.
And then I heard there was 80,000 trucks, not just the 10 or 20,000 or 5,000 or so drayage trucks I knew of. It's like 10 times that much. Is that true?
I'm not. You're saying are affected by this rule, or?
Yeah, are affected by have to solve the problem by September 1st in order to get the money. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah, no, again, for public fleets, it's starting in 2024, half the purchases would have to be zero emission from that point forward.
Starting in 24. Okay, yeah. So
if they're not making purchases in 24, it doesn't change anything, and if they are, then it would.
Okay, so then, all right, well then it's, okay, well that makes things a lot easier. Now, the other big piece of what I want to talk about is making a separate set of provisions for conversions prior to and instead of replacement. And also, I did a calculation. You get, so let's say for one of the pots of money, $600 million roughly. If you divide that by $200,000 for a conversion and rehabilitation of a truck or bus, a large one, heavy duty, you divide that by 200,000, you get 3,000 trucks, not 40,000 trucks, or whatever, the
Hey, Mark, maybe we can have this discussion offline. I mean, the graphs show you how many trucks we expect to be zero emission with the transition of the entire regulation, not just the public portion. And it starts relatively modestly at the beginning.
Yeah, okay, so in other words, we have time.
Yeah, I mean, we are factoring in this phase-in strategy to ultimately recognize that there's going to be an early transition phase here and then a significant ramp up over time. And that is largely time to align with practicality of getting infrastructure in place. Fleets are going to have to learn, gain some experience in operating the vehicles because this is a newer technology and so on.
Well, actually, I think that the timeline there, it would be good to show what happens if we do conversions in volume starting in 2 years or a year from now instead, because this graph could be radically different.
No, Mark, this represents what the requirements in essence would likely be the outcome. Whether they do a conversion or buy new doesn't change that. If anybody's wondering, conversion that you do now would still count as a ZEV purchase in the future.
Okay, no, what I mean is that the time to get the fleet change converted is a lot less than the time waiting for the fleet to wear out. That's what I'm trying to say. If we're converting in volume, and I would like some help to do that in terms of, it should be no net negative cash flow. Oh, okay, that was something you said a few times. You were saying that the cost is lower over time, the total operating cost lower over time. But from the solar industry, there's a thing called no net negative cash flow. There's especially for the smaller, low income or smaller revenue or entities.
Yeah.
The financing needs to be a part of this, so that, and based on what the savings are, so that they're not having to pay up front for something at $600,000 instead of $300,000.
There's companies that do that. They call it vehicle as a service. Provide you a complete zero emission solution, so they exist. Okay. Hey, Mark, I'd like to move on to the next person. Is that all right? Because we are past our time, and I want to make sure everybody has a chance, and we don't cut into their lunch hour too much either.
All right, the next speaker is Nicole Rice. Nicole, I've unmuted your line. You may speak.
Hi, good afternoon. Nicole Rice, California Natural Gas Vehicle Coalition. First, I just wanted to say thank you, staff, for allowing this opportunity past our time to be able to ask these clarifying questions. There were a couple of things that were raised early on that I just wanted to get clarity on. The first one, and both of them have to do with the unavailability of the vehicle. And the reason I ask is because the language for that particular exemption seems to be borrowed to go through all the different segments of the regulation. So I think getting clarity on that is important at this point. So what I thought I heard you say, Tony, was that pre-orders, the ability to pre-order a truck would be counted as the vehicle being available, and therefore you would be ineligible for the unavailability exemption. Did I hear that correctly?
No, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. So you're referring to, I mean, because right now we have a situation where there's manufacturers that are going to have something commercially available in a couple of years and are taking pre-orders. So I wouldn't look at that as saying that they're available right now, because you can't take delivery. Nobody can. But we do recognize that, of course, anybody who orders even a diesel might take more than a year to get it. And so if that takes a year to get an electric, that's really, business as usual.
No, and I agree with the point that you raised initially in that response, and thank you for that. That if you're just taking pre-orders, that means it's not available. And there has been a lot of conversation about the unavailability exemption, so that's why I want to clarify that. So then, just to be clear, it is not your intention to include pre-orders to count for availability under the unavailability exemption.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with that said, I think there's some details that people have asked for to make sure that we draw the line more clearly. So I don't know what the best solution is at the moment, but obviously making it more clear and kind of addressing some of those nuances, I think is part of that. So we appreciate any comments on how to handle that, because again, we're trying to find the right balance. If you said, hey, I want to order a pickup today, a diesel one, and it'll take at least a year to get, and I can go buy the Ford one and it's going to take a year to get too. It's like, well, okay, then that's pretty much the same difference. Not sure that those should be dramatically different, but at the same time, if they haven't produced any, then there's more uncertainty of whether they will. And I'm not sure what the best approach is given that scenario, for example.
Okay, no, I hear you on that. And I think one way to do this is that on those, those characteristics, I guess, that are obvious, the status of the vehicles that are kind of universally agreed upon by stakeholders that should not count as availability. I think, we could maybe list those as examples of what do not count as availability in the actual language of the regulation. That could be one point. And I think there are some obvious things that would be universally understood without any loopholes, to your point earlier, amongst fleet owners, operators, and stakeholders. So that could be one example. But I'll move on to the second point. So you also raised just going back and forth in a conversation about if the standard configuration of the vehicle isn't available, but there is a configuration that could be, utilized by the fleet operator to fit the purpose. So it's not generally what they might use and would not be that standard configuration that would go to that purpose for use. But if you can find something that fits that purpose and it is available, then you would be ineligible for the unavailability exemption. Did I hear that part correctly?
Sort of. I want to make sure we get the nuance right. Yeah. So what we're trying to do is say something to the effect of, hey, you need a tanker truck and you can't get a tanker, then it's not considered available. Whether you want one from a particular tank body manufacturer or another isn't going to be part of that decision. But if you need a tank truck and there's a dump truck that can carry water or something like that, no, we're not talking about that.
Okay.
So we're talking about the same application. What's the primary intended function of the body of that truck in essence? What's it supposed to do? If it's available from 3 different suppliers and it's not the one you like, doesn't matter at that point. That still means it's available. You should be able to do it.
Okay. Because to that point, I think it would be important to, if that's kind of how we're going to slice that, to really talk about what maybe a material difference is, and to distinguish between what is material and what is immaterial, because, to the example you used, I think also during that conversation about, if it has, if you want 4 cup holders, but it only has 2, that's not necessarily a material difference. But to the extent that there is a material difference, or if, that's something that the fleet owner could demonstrate that, even though there is a vehicle that might be able to carry water, it creates or sets up a material difference that relates to safety of, the driver, the operator, the operations, and functionality itself. That should be something that the fleet owner should be able to speak to when applying for the exemption. So I think those types of things should be clearly identified in the language.
Let's make sure we're talking the same language, and this is for everybody listening. So what we have in there is the term primary intended function, and it's kind of like, yeah, what is the key purpose of this particular vehicle body or vehicle configuration? I'm not sure if you're suggesting that we go beyond that and then do something that's custom to every fleet that would be then dependent on the details of how they might use their water truck or something like that. And so we're trying to, and if you are, then that's increasing the level of complexity quite a bit more. This is sort of an attempt to be, responsive to the concern that the technology might not be available in the application needed, but if it's available for at least one vehicle in that configuration, then presumably it's no longer an issue of being commercially available. It's more about the ultimate choice on the types of vehicles that the fleets are most interested in.
Yeah, no, I think my point is, to the extent that primary intended purpose could extend beyond the actual vehicle specification and class that is normally, for which is normally used, to something that could be fit for that purpose, then that needs to be, we need to start talking about not just a subjective determination of fit for purpose, but start looking at something that's more objective, where you could be looking at material difference as, as a means to, make that determination, or something else that would allow the fleet owner to unpack that a little bit more. Because again, it sounded like you were saying, as long as it can be fit for purpose, it doesn't necessarily have to be, in my understanding of the phrase, the primary intended purpose for which the vehicle is used.
Okay, I missed that comment. I mean, the primary intended function is what defines what the purpose of the vehicle is. And so if we need to modify that language to make it more clear, I mean, that is our goal. So we're trying to find that right balance of making it clear and to a degree addressing I think some of the issues you're alluding to, but again, anybody who wants to comment on that, we'd appreciate it. And maybe you could even, again, pictures are always helpful to say, hey, these two trucks are both bucket trucks, but here's some really key differences that need to be factored in because they're not the same, even though they have the same general purpose. Maybe there's some significant differences in terms of their operation that, you know, I'll say that I'm not fully aware of. To the extent you can bring those to our attention, maybe we can better define it.
And then this is all still left, or let me back up. So the granting of the exemption in this case or any other case is still left to the sole discretion of the executive officer of CARB, correct?
In essence, yes, but the criteria is, the ideal way we would do this is these are the criteria. You know, 10 people out of 10 people should look at that and say, yes, these criteria all apply. Therefore, the executive officer has to approve it. It's not truly subjective. I mean, but again, nothing's perfect, but we're trying to make it as black and white as possible for each of the key points.
I mean, I think one thing is on this vehicle.
Demonstration we can prove.
I guess one thing that is on this vehicle unavailability exemption, the idea is that when you're reporting your vehicles, you'd be able to just select the exemption off a list and the list of unavailable vehicles would be there. And as long as you do that, I don't think there would be any need for additional verification other than submitting photos of the vehicle once it's delivered.
Yeah, so maybe when we separate those two. I mean, first is getting the vehicle on the list, but once it's on the
Right.
list, the fleet just buys them and reports that they bought it, and that's it.
Right. And I think my point that I'm making goes to more so to how the vehicle gets on the list and what those decisions will be made, what decisions will be made to populate that list. So to the extent that we can have, you know, a process set up on the back end, which I think staff is looking to do, that clearly states how that list gets populated, how stakeholders can inform those decisions and the like would be helpful, and maybe answer some of the questions that I've raised and that have been brought up during this conversation and in the previous workshop.
Yeah, so I'll just say, so the language we put into the regulation is the intent is to cover that. And so again, I think this is one, look at the details. Here's the basic criteria. To the extent that something's ambiguous, it's like, hey, this would make it a whole lot clearer. But that's what's going to be the guiding decision point. Can I buy it already as a zero emission? If I can, then it's not going to be on the list. If it's in the class 4 through 6 and and it's a dump truck and I can't get a dump truck for any reason at all, it's going to go on the list. I mean, so those are the criteria that we'll be using. And so as long as those criteria apply, it gets listed. I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And
okay.
So as long as we just need to make that criteria as clear as we can.
Yes, definitely. I agree with the need to maximum clarity in all of this would be very helpful. I think just the last thing I'll say, just a quick comment. I know, you know, has been discussion about the omnibus standard and Tom Swenson, Todd Campbell earlier kind of unpacked a little bit of that. I will just say that I know, you know, staff has been suggesting that once the standard is in place, that those engines that are subject to the standard will be able to meet that standard. And I just think that it can be somewhat of a misstatement to suggest that all engines that will be subject to that standard will actually be able to meet the standard. Just because the requirement is there does not necessarily mean that the engine will be able to meet that standard. And so therefore, I think it's a misstatement to suggest that once that standard becomes effective, that all combustion engines will be at the same, you know, cleanliness or will be synonymous, which it sounds like the comments that have been made suggest that. Because unless and until the engine can meet that standard, that will not be the case. So I just think it's important to make sure that the statements match reality, which is we don't know whether or not all combustion engines will be able to meet that standard. We do know that there are engines that are functioning today, the natural gas engines that are planning to meet that 0.02 standard, certainly by 2027, maybe even before that, as early as 2024. That still is a decision that's left to be made. But the fact that to suggest that every engine will be able to meet that standard and therefore be equal with each other, I think it's a little early to make that declaration. So just wanted to put that out there as well.
I'm not sure I phrase that differently. It will be illegal to sell engines in this state that don't meet that standard.
I understand.
So maybe there'll be fewer sold or something if that's what you're referring to. But okay. But
thank you.
Okay, next person.
All right, next in line, I've got 10 more people in line and it's 12:30. So just a reminder, try to keep your comments brief. Lisa McGee, you're next in line. I've unmuted your mic, you may speak.
Hi, this is Lisa. Thank you for this. I think this is a great dialogue that you guys are open to this discussion today. I have a few comments. What did you say, when is the first board hearing for this?
It's October of this year.
It's October of this year? Okay. And then as it relates to, I want to also just kind of make sure that we're not losing sight of, I guess, what the purpose of this is, to move forward towards the future of the technology. You know, today, HFIP still has $10 million of general funding, 16 million for e-fleets, and 54 million for transit. So, you know, I heard a few comments, not a lot, but, you know, slow is the way to start. Early is the way to solve and get compliant, get the experiences, understand what you don't know. It really is different. And it's not as bad as what we've all maybe have heard over the years, because there were really early adoption experiences that were terrible. You know, the technology has come very far, so I encourage everybody to take advantage of the funding. You've really put together a real flexible program here. So I wanted to ask some questions on the flexibility of an order versus the pursuage towards compliance. Is this regulation only for the ACF, or will that apply to other medium heavy duty ZEB regulations for other vocations? Just curious.
I missed the question. So you're referring to today's presentation?
Yeah, you know, the order versus the pursuage, you know, the flexibility towards compliance, is that only for ACF, or would that apply to other vocations under the ZEB regulations under different, obviously, regulatory?
So for the state and local government fleets, the rule construct is a purchase requirement. So anything that you're purchasing or adding to your fleet is the criteria, and it's based on when you make those purchases to align with the purchasing process. The other parts of the rule work differently for drayage and for the commercial fleets, or what we're calling high priority and federal.
Okay, they're different. Okay, got it. All right. Okay, then on the slide 19, replacing, I want to elaborate on that. The 50%, I get that it's 50% for 2024 to 2026, but I want some clarity on what's 50%. Is it a ZEB? Is it new? Is it every GVWR, or does it start only at 8,500? Kind of curious what that definition is.
So the regulation applies for this category is anything over 8,500 pounds GVWR. Okay. So that starts at pickups and vans all the way up to Class 8 trucks. And so it's 50%. 50% of what you buy or add, to your fleet. So whether you're buying brand new vehicles or conversions or something else, as long as half of what you're purchasing or adding to your fleet is zero emission. When you're replacing your trucks, I mean, it's up to you as to when you normally replace them.
Okay.
But the idea is go at least 50% zero emission in those purchases moving forward, and then 100% starting in 27.
Okay, and so if you don't, so in theory, what you're also saying here, because I want to make sure we're grasping this, because it sounds very flexible, but if you don't purchase anything between 2024, then you don't trigger a requirement, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
There will be a reporting piece, but that's all.
Right. But very, very flexible. I just want to make sure we're not missing these very significant modifications that you put forth in this proposal that is more than flexible and more than reasonable. So I feel like some of the comments that I heard today on the unavailability and exemption really weighed heavy on that. And I think it could potentially be a loophole associated with focusing on that versus transitioning towards the ZEV future. And I look at the phase in, the flexibility, the transitional balance, your interest to understand everybody's concerns. One, just greatly appreciated. And my comments to that would be is, again, going back to making sure that the stakeholders look at the phase-in approach as a solution, and get started early with the funding programs and tie it to aging out, and avoid any of these loopholes that, one thing I kind of wanted to also address it related to exemptions, and the last speaker kind of honed in on some things that I think was well said.
Lisa, let me jump in actually, because you triggered a thought here, because it relates to a variety of comments. Yeah, one of the concepts of the vehicle is not available. If you're buying 10 vehicles, according to this in 2024, and it's like make sure 5 of them are zero emission. If you find that, hey, there's 2 or 3 here that weren't available as ZEVs out of the 5 diesels that you're buying, you're still going to have to buy your 5 ZEVs to meet your 50%. The exemption is not intended to. It wouldn't count as it wasn't available. It's the same as buying a ZEV. It's just it wasn't available. You just go ahead and buy the diesel, but chances are what you're buying, it won't be that challenging to make sure that half of what you buy is a ZEV that is available, that meets your application and needs, and so on.
Okay, good. Well, and that's how I thought I understood it. I just wasn't sure that it transitioned through to everybody's comments. I wasn't sure, but I'm just, again, just my opinion here as it relates to making sure that we can avoid, further exemptions and further delays by stakeholders, because I do think this is the pathway and an opportunity to move forward. And what I have witnessed and been a part of on the OEM side is that, without stakeholders becoming more open to and less resistant to the adoption, there are multiple things that you could use as a delay or interest that you have to make your vehicle exactly as you're used to. I've gotten crazy things as even branding colors, which is reasonable from what they're used to. But in this case, the OEMs can't make the plastic blue in the vehicle today because it just doesn't make it affordable. And so I think some of the things that I have seen and witnessed is something that requires the fleet to be open. And I really like what the last speaker said on the material differences. I think CARB putting something under this exemption provision to make sure that we can identify what is considered reasonable or what is the reasonableness of not being reasonable, or not being available, is something that came to my thoughts in hearing some of the comments. And let's see, let me see. On the duty cycle and the applications and the concerns related to range, what I've been able to understand from my own experiences, this goes back to 2015. The fleet that I've been a part of with San Diego has been 100% zero emissions since 2020, December 2020 now. They run about 600 miles a day on the fleet and have gotten rid of all diesel. What you find is that many of the battery concerns that you might think in an application, you got to pick the winners and make it easy for yourself. But we have found that, we've had better outcomes today than we would have ever thought and imagined, mainly because of the technology advancing. And that is particular to high power charging is a real good solution. For example, if you've got a 150 kilowatt battery, and you plug it in for 150, well, it's going to be charged in 1 hour if it was empty, for example. So I just want to make sure that some of those solutions aren't missed. And public charging, I just did an assessment for someone actually yesterday, and uniquely that fleet had 10 public chargers available to them with high voltage fast charging 1.6 miles away. This open 24/7. And so they wanted to get started early. So it's a solution. So I think some of these things, I don't know how you'll couple this with your reasonableness as it relates to exemptions, but I think Those need to be considered. And then the RFI and the RFPs is my last comment, and bids not happening. I agree with that. I think the agencies need to understand the technology better so that we're not speccing out the technology before it has an opportunity to participate in a bid. And not every OEM or maybe some of the transportation contractors are participating to educate the agencies on what the RFP needs to be included for an RFI. So hopefully that makes sense. And thank you for your proposal.
Thank you.
Next in line to speak is Catherine Larson. Catherine, I have unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Catherine Larson with CAPA. Just want to say thanks again for the discussion today. I have 3 very brief questions. I think we'll go quickly. Clarifications. The first is about the infrastructure construction delay. So as I read it, that allows fleets to defer the delivery of ZEVs they've already ordered, but public fleet compliance with the proposed rule or the draft rule would be based on the order date or the purchase date anyway, not the delivery date. So what is this exemption intended to do for public fleet compliance?
So the language is worded to say, hey, you have to order the vehicle for immediate delivery. Because so we don't want you to just say, hey, I put out a bid, I can take a delivery over to the next 10 years, but I'm not committed to any of them. I can do it 6 years down the road. That's what we don't want to have. And so this would in essence say, hey, you order the vehicle for immediate delivery. It'll be available before the infrastructure comes. Then this says, hey, the door is open for you to tell the manufacturer, delay the delivery. And so you, at that point, you are asking them to delay delivery, and that would be conflicting with the first part of the rule that says you have to take immediate delivery. That's largely what it would address.
Okay, so there's an assumption, or perhaps implicit or explicit, that you need to take immediate
Yeah,
delivery.
if it helps, our transit and embedded clean transit regulation has the same basic approach, and so we figured, hey, it's going to be the same thing. Largely similar, a lot of similarities between the two, okay. The way the rules work.
Thanks. In terms of fleet ownership, in the last draft, or maybe just the discussion around the last draft, our understanding was that maybe municipalities that have multiple fleets, utility, public works, and so on, might have the option to comply either as individual fleets or as a single city fleet. I didn't see that explicitly in the draft language, so wondering if this is still something that is being contemplated for the rule, or you think would fit within the current language? Because it's based on the registry.
No, I do recall that, and I don't remember purposely removing it, but I don't remember where there's language to that effect anymore. So, because we don't see a concern that if you have multiple departments and each one just make sure that half the purchases are zero emission, that they comply separately isn't going to present an issue. And if they say, hey, no, it's way more flexible for us to report as a group because we're going to do most or all of the vehicles in one department and none in the other department, then that would be fine too. I don't think it matters too much. Okay. So I don't think we intentionally removed it. So I guess we'll just go back and look at that language.
Thanks for that. And then the last question, my question is, have you thought at all, it's currently proposed as a ZEV unavailability list, but if you're identifying the criteria up front either way, have you thought at all about making it a ZEV availability list where you've got the criteria and maybe manufacturers, OEMs provide info to get listed? Seems like that could help a lot with clarity and avoid scenarios where.
Yeah, no, so I agree. I mean, I think it'd be a whole lot easier, but that list of what's available is going to be really, really long. At the same time, though, I mean, I concur, but what we're trying to do is figure out what do we have to put in the regulation, which is kind of the minimum. Where the other parts of our goals is, yeah, we want to make sure fleets do understand what their options are, what is available, what works for them, what doesn't, all of these other types of things, including what's available and things like that. And part of answering the question is what's not available. Ultimately will be, yeah, here's everything that exists, here's all the configurations, so, and this is the reason that they're not on the unavailable list. So there's a little bit of, we want to do both of those, but we don't need to do that per se in the regulation. And so that's where we're trying to find the balance.
Thank you, and thanks again for the time today.
Thank you.
Next in line to speak is Tom Green. Tom, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak. Tom, your mic's mute. It's still muted on your end.
Hi, I wanted to talk about, well, a few things, but the exemption for not to apply for buses, pickups, truck vans, tractors. And I just wanted to say, one of the big things that we require is we have to tow a lot of equipment up the hills to get the pipes fixed. I'm with Rancho California Water District.
Well, thank you.
And so it's not just availability. They have to have a gross combination weight rating, and I haven't seen anything in this regulation that addresses that we have to be able to tow equipment. So it may be available as a pickup, but it doesn't mean it can do the job. And then you had a part there about the all-electric range for the NIRZEV vehicles. But it said you can find out how many miles are required, but it didn't, that in the regulation, it didn't say what the miles were. It just pointed to someplace else, and I looked at that someplace else, and it pointed to another place, someplace else. And it'd be nice if you just spelled it out so that we don't have this confusion.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, and again, a lot of the regulations are intertwined in many ways. But yeah, the manufacturers, when they sell the vehicles, they have to meet a minimum mileage criteria to be eligible to count those sales towards their compliance. So largely, the fleet themselves wouldn't need to know that detail. But yeah, well, I understand the comment, and we will look to figure out how to make it more obvious. But again, there's a sales requirement for the manufacturer. If they don't meet that requirement, they don't get any credit for that sale. So I'm sure they'll be meeting the requirement if they're producing a plug-in hybrid type vehicles.
Yeah, it had something to do with a testing requirement, and then I looked it up, and it said like 23 miles, and then some kind of credit, 3.5 times some kind of.
Yeah, and that's for manufacturer requirement. Paul, can you rattle off the miles? I mean, I think it starts at 10 miles.
Yeah.
Minimum all electric range starting in 2021.
Yeah, starting in 2021 model year, it's 10 miles all electric range. In 2024 model year, it increases to 20 miles all electric range. In 2027 model year, it increases again to 35 miles. And lastly, for advanced lane trucks specifically, in 2030 model year, it increases to 75 miles.
Okay. Yeah, so if you could put that in the regulation, just as it would be helpful, so we know what we're dealing with, and we have to put it in our spec for the purchase. And then there was a thing about if we were to cancel a contract, and I think there should be some provisions for canceling for non-performance. If a company doesn't do it, maybe we can switch it with another vehicle, or if, like, I think one of the major manufacturers came out and they said, hey, we're going to raise the prices 20%, and everybody was in shock, and they finally backtracked. But if a company doesn't do that, maybe we could also switch out for another vehicle. It shouldn't lock us out from getting a vehicle. And then there was a couple things here, 2013.3B and G, which don't seem to make sense as to how they apply. And I think maybe those are from the one of the other, maybe the non-government fleets or something. They have to do with hiring and documentation of drivers to pay, or terminal destination for cargo. So maybe that could be clarified or taken out. It doesn't seem to make sense. And then also one other question I had as a public fleet, we're wondering, are there any requirements for us for the lower vehicles, the half-ton vehicles, or that we need to know about and look into?
So you're referring to vehicles below 8,500 pounds, or yeah, 8,500 pounds or
Correct.
below, the F-150s and those kinds, and passenger cars?
Yes.
And not as part of this proposal, unless you're delivering mail or something that would be, but you wouldn't be in this category. There's a different group within our agency that is proposing the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation that will ramp up all light duty vehicle sales ultimately to 100% by 2035. That's something I think our board considers either this year. I think it considers this year.
Yeah, that's
well.
going to the board this
So-
June. And to be clear, that's a manufacturer requirement. So the manufacturers need to meet those sales targets.
So they'll, yeah, so but we're targeting the manufacturer, but ultimately it's significantly increasing the number of ZEVs that they have to sell out of their total sales in the light duty category.
Okay, so it's just a manufacturer requirement, not a buyer requirement.
Correct.
Point.
Correct.
Okay.
But
thank you.
electrification is coming more and more and more in light duty as well. So you might plan for light duty and heavy duty at locations where you have both.
Okay, and then I just want to echo some of the things that were put in by Nick from Aqua and Frank Harris from CMUA and many of the other people about the commercial availability questions. There's many things out there. I went around to 3 different dealers of the major manufacturers, and the Ford guy said, yeah, I can't even give you specs right now of what they're going to be having, and they're designing the half-ton truck now and the 3/4 ton the next year, the full 1 tons the next year, and they'll going on up. And we can't put out a purchase order if we can't even get specs for the equipment to make sure it meets our specs. So it needs to be commercially available, not just a dream that they say they're going to meet. That's all. Thanks.
Next in line to speak is David Worthington. David, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak. David, your mic is muted on your end.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. But my question was answered earlier when Mr. Rentschler had his hand chosen to speak. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Next in line to speak is Rick Tebay. Rick, I've unmuted your line. You may speak. Oh, says he's not allowed to talk because he's using an older version of Zoom. Okay, so Rick, hold tight. We'll figure out a solution.
You'll either figure out a solution. If we don't figure out another one, Rick, just email us. We'll call you back or something like that.
Next in line to speak is Beverly Desho. Beverly, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Sorry, I was not raising my hand. I may have tapped it by accident. I have no comment.
Okay, thank you. And the next in line to speak is the last person besides Rick is Jesus Martinez Ramirez. Jesus, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak. Okay, so he's gone. I guess I see a 916 number. Hello. I am going to remove that. Okay, so I guess lastly is Rick. Let's try one more time, and I'm gonna try to give you a permission to talk. All right, so Rick, why don't you go ahead and send us your comments through the informal comment docket. It says I would have to promote you to a panelist to speak, and I can't do that. So the last person, and it is almost 1 o'clock, so I'm gonna try Jesus again. Jesus, I've unmuted your mic. You may speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jesus, and I oversee the fleet for San Luis Valley Water Agency. I would like to thank everyone for hosting the staff and for collecting our feedback. Our agency supports your efforts to reduce emissions and address climate change, but we just want to make sure that the goals of the regulation are realistic. I know that the staff has a really monumental task, with this regulation, so we appreciate all your efforts. The first thing that I would really like to emphasize is on emergency preparedness. So the regulation right now has an exemption for emergency vehicles for police and fire. But I would really, emphasize the fact that whenever there's an emergency or a natural disaster, it's our crews that are working right next to those police and fire during those emergencies. So there really needs to be more of an exemption for public agencies or public utilities, since, we're really helping them respond to those emergencies. And I would strongly encourage staff and the board to consider providing maybe like a 15% exemption and allowing the public utilities to designate 15% of your fleet as emergency response vehicles. And I think that would really kind of help address some of these anxiety that we have with these new regulations, to be able to designate those vehicles so that they're exempt from the regulation. The second thing that I would really like to focus on is on the timeline and the cost. As far as the timeline, it's a little bit concerning that the timeline has not been adjusted, considering the delays that we face because of COVID, as well as all of the aftermath that it caused. Right, there's a lot of public agencies that are still trying to recover financially to be able to to address this based on everything that the lost revenue that happened for the last 2 to 3 years. So I think the staff should really consider looking at the timeline. The other thing is, I would really, ask the staff is, have the big manufacturer said that they are going to have a truck that has, 8,500 pounds GVWR by 2024. And if they can't guarantee that, then I would really encourage you to delay slightly the implementation. And I would also say, right, we need to focus on public or fleet management 101, right? This is not it shouldn't be a one solution. There's other low-hanging fruit that fleets should be able to do, and also more importantly, get credit for as far as reducing emissions. There should be some credit for implementing, other alternative fuels, as well as idle mitigation technologies that should be taken into account. And then the last thing that I would really like the staff to talk about is about noncompliance. And I ask that for two things. The first one is, there's a lot of factors, as everybody else has mentioned, that's going to be outside of the control of fleets, that the fleet may find itself in compliance. So what's going to happen then? And the second one, it's also so we can communicate that to our boards and city councils, so they understand the importance, right, of being able to prioritize this, because these projects, as far as infrastructure and replacing vehicles, are competing against other capital projects, for limited public funds. So again, I would strongly encourage you to consider providing or allowing agencies, public utility agencies, to designate 15% of our vehicles as mission criticals and exempt from the regulation. So expanding the coverage of an emergency response vehicle. And then also, if you can briefly, address what happens to, in the event that a fleet finds itself in non-compliance. Thanks again for the opportunity for public comment, and I look forward to, future opportunities for us to provide feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's
All right,
it for
I
the
think-
speakers. Yeah.
I think that's it, Molly, right?
Yeah, that's it. I don't see any more hands.
All right. So we're 1 hour over our allotted time, but we do appreciate your comments, and we're hopeful that this workshop was beneficial. Just want to remind everybody that we will hold our last of our series of 3 workshops this Friday. And that workshop will be focused on the drayage truck requirements of this regulation. So if that affects you, please tune in. And one final reminder that comments, I know we are listening. We took down the comments that you made today, but please submit your written comments to our informal comment docket. The information is available on our website. It's also on the slide deck. That is also helpful. And with that said, I will thank everybody again, and we'll be available through our website.